At my divorce hearing, my mother-in-law leaned in and sneered that leaving me was her son's best choice. She had no idea that the $3 million I sacrificed to save their family business wasn't lost to market forces like my husband claimed. It was stolen, and the bank records I was about to uncover would make her cruel lie completely impossible to maintain. The fluorescent lights of the Cook County Family Courthouse buzzed overhead with a dull, irritating hum. The air in the hallway smelled of old paper floor wax and broken promises. I sat on a hard-wooden bench in the corridor, holding a cheap blue pen. On my lap was a thick stack of temporary separation papers. My name is Rachel. I am 34 years old, and I work as a corporate restructuring consultant. I fix broken companies for a living, analyzing their debts, cutting their losses, and bringing them back from the brink of failure. But looking at the legal documents in my lap, I realized I had completely failed to restructure my own life. Barbara, my mother-in-law, sat on the opposite side of the hallway. She wore her signature pearl necklace, a tailored cashmere cardigan, and an expression of pure, unadulterated triumph. She smelled of expensive gin and entitlement, a scent I had endured for 5 years of marriage. She stood up, her heels clicking sharply against the linoleum floor, and walked over to where I sat. She did not sit down next to me. Instead, she leaned over, invading my personal space, her perfectly manicured hands resting on her designer handbag. She lowered her voice, so the lawyers chatting by the courtroom doors could not hear her. "Leaving you was my son's best choice." She whispered, every word dripping with venom. "You are a cold, calculating woman, Rachel. You never understood our family, and you certainly never understood how to make a man happy. I am just glad Bradley finally woke up and realized he deserves a woman with actual warmth." I did not cry. I did not flinch. I did not give her the satisfaction of seeing my heart break into a million pieces. In my line of work, you learn very quickly that emotion is a massive liability when the numbers are on the table. You observe, you calculate, and you wait. I simply looked up at her, my face a perfect, unreadable mask, and went back to reading the temporary order. Barbara let out a huff of disgust, muttered something about my lack of soul, and walked back to her side of the hall. A moment later, the heavy wooden doors of the courtroom swung open, and my husband walked out. Bradley was 36 years old, tall, handsome, and wearing a custom-tailored navy suit that probably cost more than the average person makes in a month. He was the CEO of his family's century-old printing and packaging business, a legacy he proudly paraded around Chicago's elite social circles. Right now, he was playing the role of the sorrowful, defeated victim to absolute perfection. He walked over to me, running a hand through his perfectly styled hair, looking exhausted and broken. "Rachel, I am so sorry it had to come to this," he said, his voice thick with fake remorse. "I never wanted us to end up in a courthouse. You have to believe me. I just could not handle the stress anymore. The business is failing. The market forces have completely destroyed our supply chain margins, and I feel like I have failed you." I stared at the signature line on the separation papers. The terms of this temporary order were heavily disadvantaged against me. I was agreeing to move out of our marital home temporarily. I was waiving any right to immediate spousal support. I was taking on the burden of my own living expenses while the divorce proceeded. But the hardest pill to swallow, the detail that made my stomach churn with nausea, was the financial disclosure statement attached to the back. 2 years ago, Bradley came to me in tears. The printing business was on the verge of bankruptcy due to outdated machinery and lost client contracts. He begged me for help. I had recently inherited a trust fund from my late grandfather, a hardworking man who spent 50 years building a successful hardware franchise from scratch. That money was my safety net, my future. But Bradley was my husband. I loved him. I believed in his vision, and I believed in our marriage. So I liquidated my grandfather's trust and injected $3 million directly into Bradley's company. Now, according to the documents Bradley had just filed with the court, under penalty of perjury, that $3 million was gone. He claimed the capital injection had been completely absorbed by corporate debts, lost to aggressive market forces, inflation, and a failed expansion strategy. He claimed he was virtually broke. "I know you are angry about the money," Bradley whispered, placing a hand on my shoulder. I felt a physical urge to shove him away, but I stayed perfectly still. I swear to you, Rachel, I tried everything to save the investment, but the industry changed too fast. The money just burned up in operational costs. I will spend the rest of my life trying to pay you back, even if we are not together. I looked at his hand resting on my shoulder. The platinum wedding band was still on his finger. He was such a good actor. A woman walking past us in the hallway actually gave him a sympathetic smile, entirely convinced by his performance of a broken man mourning his failed business and his failed marriage. I picked up the cheap blue pen and signed my name on the dotted line. I signed away my home, I signed away my immediate financial security, and I accepted the devastating loss of my grandfather's legacy. I handed the stack of papers to my attorney. Bradley let out a long, heavy sigh of relief, offering me one last tragic, apologetic look before walking away with his mother. Barbara wrapped her arm around her son, shooting me a final victorious glare over her shoulder. I walked out of the courthouse alone. The cold Chicago wind hit my face the moment I pushed through the revolving glass doors, biting through my wool coat. The sky was an unforgiving, overcast gray. I walked down the concrete steps, keeping my posture straight and my steps measured until I reached the privacy of the underground parking garage. I unlocked my car, climbed into the driver's seat, and slammed the door shut. The silence of the car was deafening. For a brief second, the exhaustion threatened to crush me. I leaned my forehead against the steering wheel, squeezing my eyes shut. 5 years of marriage, $3 million. All gone, leaving me sitting alone in a cold parking garage with nothing but a temporary separation order. Suddenly, my phone buzzed in my purse. The sharp vibration broke through the heavy silence. I pulled the phone out. It was a secure, encrypted message notification. A few weeks ago, when Bradley first asked for a divorce out of nowhere and claimed my investment was entirely lost, my professional instincts had kicked in. Companies do not just burn through $3 million in untraceable operational costs without leaving a massive paper trail. I had quietly hired a private forensic financial investigator named David. I paid him out of my last remaining personal savings to dig into the back end of Bradley's printing business. I tapped the screen, entering my passcode to unlock the encrypted email. David had sent a single file labeled with the company name, followed by a short message. Rachel, you were right to trust your gut. The money did not burn up in operational costs. I followed the wire transfers. Check page 4. My heart began to pound against my ribs, a slow, heavy rhythm of adrenaline. I opened the PDF file. It was a comprehensive forensic trace of the company's accounts payable over the last 18 months. I scrolled past the dense financial jargon, my trained eyes easily translating the data. I reached page 4. David had uncovered a series of recurring massive vendor payments. Every month, Bradley had been authorizing enormous wire transfers for supposed raw materials, specialized ink imports, and premium cardboard supplies. The payments were sent to a logistics vendor called Horizon Creative Solutions. I frowned, staring at the screen. I knew the printing business supply chain inside and out. I had personally audited their books 2 years ago when I made the investment. Horizon Creative Solutions was not on any approved vendor list I had ever seen. I read the next paragraph of David's report. Horizon Creative Solutions was not a real logistics vendor. It was a shell company incorporated in Delaware just 2 weeks after I deposited my $3 million into Bradley's corporate account. The shell company existed solely to generate fake invoices. Bradley had been approving these fake invoices, effectively siphoning the money out of his own failing company. I swiped the screen, moving to page 5. Where did the money go? David had tracked the routing numbers. The funds wired to Horizon Creative Solutions were immediately bounced through 2 other dummy corporations before landing securely in a private offshore bank account in the Cayman Islands. The $3 million was not lost to market forces. It had been systematically and deliberately stolen by my own husband, funneled offshore, and hidden entirely from the divorce proceedings. A cold, terrifying clarity washed over me. The sadness that had been suffocating me for weeks instantly evaporated, replaced by a sharp, burning fury. But the ultimate shock was waiting on the final page of the report. David had managed to pull the corporate registration documents for the Delaware Shell Company. To open an offshore account, someone had to be listed as the primary beneficial owner. Someone had to sign the dotted line. It could not be Bradley, because that would tie him directly to the embezzlement. He needed a proxy. He needed someone he trusted implicitly to hold the stolen millions. I zoomed in on the scanned incorporation document. They're listed as the sole proprietor and managing director of Horizon Creative Solutions was a name that made the blood freeze in my veins. Madison. Madison was 25 years old. She was bubbly energetic and possessed a degree in graphic design that was barely worth the paper it was printed on. Bradley had hired her 6 months ago to be the company's new creative director. I remembered the day she was hired. I had even taken her out to lunch to welcome her to the team. I had given her advice on how to navigate the corporate structure. She had sat across from me, smiling sweetly, thanking me for being such a wonderful mentor. All this time, while I was working 80-hour weeks at my consulting firm to cover our home mortgage, because Bradley claimed his salary was frozen, he was funneling my grandfather's inheritance into a secret offshore account controlled by a 25-year-old girl. They were not just having an affair. They were running a highly coordinated felony-level financial heist against me. I sat in the cold, dim parking garage, staring at the digital proof of my husband's ultimate betrayal. He thought he was so smart. He thought he could play the sorrowful victim in front of the judge, shed a few fake tears, and walk away with a clean divorce, leaving me with nothing, while he and his young mistress lived like royalty on a beach in the Cayman Islands. Barbara thought her son was a genius for discarding a cold, calculating woman like me. They had severely underestimated exactly what a corporate restructuring consultant does for a living. I do not just manage money. I dismantle failing systems. I find the rot, I isolate it, and I surgically remove it without an ounce of mercy. I turned off the engine of my car. I did not want to go back to my temporary apartment to cry. I did not want to wallow in self-pity. The heartbreak had officially morphed into a high-stakes financial war, and Bradley had just handed me the weapon I needed to destroy him. I picked up my phone and dialed my lawyer's direct line. She answered on the second ring. "Rachel," she said, her voice gentle. "Are you all right?" I know today was incredibly difficult. The temporary order is unfair, but we will fight for a better settlement in the final decree. "I do not care about the temporary order anymore," I replied, my voice steady, cold, and echoing with absolute certainty. "I just received a forensic report. Bradley did not lose my $3 million. He embezzled it through a shell company to an offshore account controlled by his 25-year-old mistress." The line went dead silent for a moment as the weight of my words registered. When my lawyer spoke again, the gentle tone was completely gone, replaced by the sharp predatory edge of a litigator who had just been handed a winning lottery ticket. "Do you have proof?" she asked. "I have the routing numbers, the shell company registration, and the Cayman Islands account details," I said, starting the engine of my car. The engine roared to life in the empty, concrete garage. "What do you want to do?" she asked. I put the car into drive, my hands gripping the steering wheel tight enough to turn my knuckles white. "I do not just want a divorce," I told her. "I want my money back. I want his company, and I want to watch him lose everything he has ever cared about." File the discovery motions. The game has officially changed. The morning sun poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows of my home office, casting long golden shadows across the hardwood floors. I stood by my mahogany desk, methodically placing files and reference books into a sleek, leather briefcase. The house was perfectly quiet, a rare commodity in the sprawling 5-bedroom colonial in Evanston that I had meticulously decorated over the last 5 years. According to the temporary separation order I had signed at the courthouse the previous afternoon, I had until the end of the week to gather my personal belongings and vacate the premises. Bradley had insisted on putting the deed to this house in his family trust shortly after we bought it. He claimed it was a necessary move for tax liabilities and estate planning. I had agreed, trusting my husband, blinded by the illusion of our partnership. That trust was exactly what he and his mother relied on when they ambushed me in court. They assumed that because the deed was held by the trust, they held all the power. They assumed I would pack my bags, cry in my car, and quietly disappear into a small rented apartment while they popped champagne. They were wrong. I took a slow sip of my black coffee from a ceramic mug. The warmth grounded me. After discovering the forensic accounting report yesterday confirming that Bradley had stolen my $3 million inheritance and funneled it to an offshore account in the Cayman Islands under his 25-year-old mistress's name, my entire perspective had shifted. I was no longer a grieving wife. I was a corporate restructuring consultant looking at a hostile entity that needed to be dismantled piece by piece, and I was going to start with the very ground they stood on. The sharp click of the front door unlocking shattered the quiet of the morning. I did not move from my spot at the top of the stairs. I simply listened. Heavy footsteps echoed in the grand foyer, followed by the distinctive shrill laugh of my mother-in-law, Barbara. "Oh, the natural light in here is just going to be absolutely perfect for the baby," a young high-pitched voice chimed in. I walked out of my office and stood at the top of the grand staircase looking down into the entryway. Bradley had just walked through the front door, carrying a stack of flattened cardboard moving boxes under his arm. He looked incredibly pleased with himself, wearing a casual cashmere sweater and an arrogant smirk. Right behind him was Barbara, dressed in her Sunday best, clutching a designer tote bag, as if she were inspecting a hotel room. And then there was Madison, the 25-year-old creative director of Bradley's printing company, the owner of the offshore shell corporation that currently held my grandfather's legacy. She stepped into the foyer wearing a tight-ribbed maternity dress that prominently displayed her swollen belly. She rested her hand on it protectively, looking up at the vaulted ceiling and the crystal chandelier I had personally picked out and paid for. "It really is a beautiful space," Madison continued, running her hand along the edge of the console table. "But we will definitely need to have the decorators come in tomorrow to strip out all this dreary gray paint. It is far too cold. We need warm tones for the nursery." Barbara smiled warmly at the young woman, a smile she had rarely ever directed at me. "Absolutely, sweetheart. We will make this house a proper home for you." I took another sip of my coffee. The ceramic clinked softly against my teeth, the sound catching Bradley's attention. He looked up, his smirk faltering for just a fraction of a second before he quickly plastered on his fake, apologetic expression. He dropped the flattened cardboard boxes onto the floor with a loud thud. Rachel Bradley called out, his voice echoing up the stairs. "I know the temporary court order gives you until the end of the week to vacate, but we thought it would be easier if we just helped you pack up your things today. Madison needs to get settled in, and the stress of waiting around is not good for the baby." I walked down the stairs slowly, my hand gliding along the polished oak railing. I did not rush. I let the silence stretch out, forcing them to stand awkwardly in the foyer as I descended. When I reached the bottom step, I looked at Madison. She did not have the decency to look ashamed. Instead, she lifted her chin, mirroring Barbara's entitlement. Barbara stepped forward, clearly eager to deliver the killing blow she had undoubtedly practiced in the mirror all morning. "Let us not make this harder than it has to be." "Rachel," Barbara said, her tone dripping with condescension. "The house belongs to the family trust. You understand how these legal things work, do you not? A house like this is meant for a real family. Now that Bradley is finally having a son, they need the space to build their life. You have 24 hours to gather your clothes and your personal items and vacate the premises. We will be changing the locks tomorrow morning." I looked at Barbara, noting the way she touched her pearl necklace, a nervous habit she displayed whenever she thought she had won an argument. I did not yell. I did not cry. I did not throw my coffee in her face, no matter how much she deserved it. "A real family," I repeated, letting the words hang in the air like a heavy fog. "It is fascinating how much you care about the family trust, Barbara. It is an absolute shame your son did not care enough to actually pay for it." Bradley frowned, taking a step towards me. "What are you talking about?" he demanded. "Just take the boxes, Rachel. Do not make a scene in front of Madison." I walked past him, ignoring his demand entirely. I moved to the console table near the front door, right where Madison had just been running her hands. Earlier this morning, before they arrived, I had carefully placed a single thick legal envelope on that table. I picked it up, feeling the heavy weight of the premium paper inside. I turned around and held the envelope out to Bradley. He hesitated, looking at the envelope as if it were a venomous snake, before finally snatching it from my hand. He ripped open the flap and pulled out the legal documents. I watched his eyes scan the first page. It took exactly 4 seconds for all the color to completely drain from his handsome, arrogant face. While you were busy wiring my $3 million into a fraudulent offshore account in the Cayman Islands under Madison's name, I said, making sure to look directly at Madison as I said her name out loud. I watched the young girl gasp and stumble backward a step, her eyes wide with sudden terror. Yes, Madison, I know about the account. And I know about the shell company. The shell. Bradley's hands began to shake violently. He stared at the paper, his mouth opening and closing without any sound coming out. While you were financing your new life with my money, I continued, my voice perfectly even and entirely lethal. You clearly forgot to pay the mortgage on this beautiful colonial. 6 months of missed payments, Bradley. The bank initiated foreclosure proceedings last Tuesday. Barbara gasped, stepping toward her son. Foreclosure, Bradley. Tell me she is lying right now. Tell me this is one of her sick calculating tricks. He cannot tell you I am lying, Barbara, I said smoothly, because the bank sent the default notices right to this address. I intercept the mail. Remember, I handle the administrative tasks for this household because Bradley never could. I am a corporate restructuring consultant. Do you know what my job actually entails, Barbara? When I see a distressed asset heading for bankruptcy, I know exactly how to acquire it. Bradley looked up at me, his eyes wide with a mixture of horror and realization. You bought the debt. He whispered the words, barely escaping his throat. Bingo, I replied, offering him a sharp, merciless smile. I explained the mechanics to them, slowly making sure every single word sank deep into their entitled minds. I told them how I took my annual performance bonus from my consulting firm last week. I explained how I formed a blind proxy limited liability company in Delaware. I explained how my lawyer approached the bank's distressed debt division the moment the foreclosure notice was generated. Banks do not want to go through the lengthy, expensive process of evicting homeowners and selling houses at auction. They prefer to offload the bad debt to private buyers for a lump sum of cash to clear their books. So I bought the defaulted mortgage note for pennies on the dollar. The family trust might hold the deed to this property, Bradley, I said, taking a step closer to him, forcing him to look me in the eye. But my company holds the note, and since your trust is in severe financial default, the note holder has the immediate legal right to possess, seize, and liquidate the asset. I do not just live here anymore, Bradley. I am the bank, and I am foreclosing on your family trust. Madison started crying, her hands clutching her belly as she looked frantically between me and Bradley. Bradley, what is going on? She sobbed, her high-pitched voice cracking. Where are we going to live? You said the house was yours. You promised me the nursery. Bradley spun around, pointing a shaking finger at me. You cannot do this. The judge signed a temporary order yesterday. The court gave me temporary possession of the marital home. The judge signed an order granting you temporary residence based on your fraudulent claim of ownership. I corrected him, my voice rising just enough to command the entire room. But you do not own it. You defaulted. The document currently shaking in your hand is a legal court-approved notice of immediate eviction from the new primary lien holder. You have absolutely no legal right to stand in my foyer. Barbara's face had turned an alarming shade of purple. She clutched her designer bag to her chest, breathing heavily. You monster, she shrieked at me. You cold, heartless monster. We will call our lawyers. We will have this overturned. You cannot just steal a house from a pregnant woman. I looked at Barbara, feeling a profound sense of satisfaction wash over me. She had called me broken for years. She had gossiped to her church friends about my long working hours, claiming I was not a real woman because I prioritized my career over baking cookies. My career was the exact reason she was currently standing in my foyer, about to be thrown out onto the street. Call whoever you want, Barbara, I told her calmly, but your son committed mortgage fraud by failing to disclose this default to the family court yesterday. I am sure the judge will be thrilled to hear about that during our next hearing. I lifted my left wrist, pulling back the sleeve of my sweater to look at my watch. It was a classic gold timepiece, simple and efficient. "It is currently 10:15 in the morning," I announced to the room. "As the legal property owner, I am officially informing all three of you that you are trespassing on private property. You have exactly 10 minutes to pick up those flattened cardboard boxes and walk out my front door." Bradley clenched his jaw, taking a threatening step toward me. "Rachel, be reasonable. Madison is pregnant. We have nowhere else to move our things today. Just give us a week to sort this out." 10 minutes, Bradley," I repeated, reaching into my pocket and pulling out my cell phone. I unlocked the screen and opened the keypad. "If you are still standing on my hardwood floors at 10:26, I will dial 911. I will provide them with the eviction notice, and I will have all three of you dragged out of this neighborhood in handcuffs in front of all the neighbors you care so much about impressing." Madison let out a loud wail and grabbed Bradley's arm. "Bradley, let's go. I cannot be arrested. Please, let's just leave." Bradley looked at Madison, then at his mother, who was currently hyperventilating near the front door. He looked back at me, his eyes burning with a hatred that I gladly mirrored right back at him. He knew I was not bluffing. He knew I understood the law better than he ever could. "Fine," Bradley spat, his voice trembling with humiliated rage. "We are leaving. But this is not over, Rachel. I am going to destroy you in court." I highly doubt that I replied, taking a slow sip of my coffee. "I will see you at the deposition." Bradley grabbed Madison by the arm, practically dragging the crying girl out the front door. Barbara followed closely behind them, stumbling slightly on her expensive heels, her proud posture completely shattered. They did not even bother to pick up the cardboard moving boxes they had dropped on the floor. I stood in the doorway and watched them hurry down the front walkway. Bradley opened the passenger door of his luxury SUV for Madison, slamming it shut behind her. He got into the driver's seat, started the engine with a loud roar, and peeled out of the driveway, the tires screeching aggressively against the pavement. I watched the car disappear down the tree-lined suburban street. The neighborhood returned to its usual quiet peace. I stepped back inside, pulled the heavy oak door shut, and locked the deadbolt with a satisfying, solid click. I stood alone in the grand foyer of the house that now belonged entirely to me. I had won the battle for my home, but the war was far from over. Bradley was humiliated broke and backed into a desperate corner. He had lost his safe haven, and I knew a man like him would not retreat quietly. He would retaliate. He would try to starve me out financially using the business accounts he still controlled. I smiled to myself, walking back up the stairs toward my home office. He was going to try to wage a financial war against a woman who dismantled corporate supply chains for a living. I sat down at my desk, opened my laptop, and began typing. It was time to pull the supply chain logs for his printing company. It was time to find out exactly who else he had been paying with my grandfather's money. The shrill beep of the grocery store credit card reader was a sound I had not worried about since my early 20s. I stood at the checkout lane of the upscale supermarket in Evanston, watching the cashier swipe my platinum card a second time. The screen flashed bright red with the word "declined." "I am so sorry, ma'am," the teenage cashier said, his voice dropping to a sympathetic whisper. "It says the card has a hold on it. Would you like to try another payment method?" I reached into my leather wallet and pulled out my debit card. It was linked to my personal checking account, the one I had opened years ago to manage household expenses. I slid the card into the chip reader and typed in my PIN. The machine processed for 3 agonizing seconds before letting out that same shrill, humiliating beep. Insufficient funds. The woman standing in line behind me let out a heavy, irritated sigh, shifting her weight from one foot to the other. I could feel the eyes of the other shoppers boring into my back. In a wealthy suburb like this, a declined card was not just an inconvenience. It was a public spectacle. Bradley had planned this perfectly. I offered the cashier a polite, apologetic smile. "I am sorry, there must be a security hold on my accounts," I told him, keeping my voice perfectly level. "Please put the groceries back. I will sort this out with my bank." I walked out of the supermarket with my head held high, my empty canvas shopping bag slung over my shoulder. I did not run. I did not let anyone see a single drop of panic on my face. But the moment I reached the privacy of my car, I locked the doors and pulled out my smartphone. I opened my primary banking app, The screen loaded, and the reality of my husband's retaliation hit me right amid-side in the chest. My personal checking account showed a balance of $0.00. My savings account, which had held my emergency liquid cash, was completely drained. I clicked on the transaction history. Less than an hour after I had humiliated him and his pregnant mistress in the foyer of my home, Bradley had gone to a local branch. Because we had set up these accounts right after our wedding, Bradley was still listed as a joint signer on the legacy accounts. It was an administrative oversight on my part, a relic of a time when I implicitly trusted the man I married. Bradley had walked into the bank, exercised his legal right as a joint account holder, and drained every single penny of my liquid cash. He then called the credit card companies and reported my cards as stolen, freezing my lines of credit. My phone buzzed in my hand. It was a text message from Bradley. "You wanted the house, Rachel. You can sit on the floor and eat the drywall. Let us see how long you can afford to pay that shark lawyer of yours with zero cash flow." I read the message twice. He was furious about being kicked out of the marital home, so he was escalating the situation using the oldest trick in the divorce playbook. He was trying to starve me out. He knew corporate litigation was incredibly expensive. He knew that without liquid cash, I could not pay my retainer fees, I could not buy groceries, and I could not sustain a protracted legal battle. He thought he had severed my oxygen supply. He thought I would be forced to call him begging for a meager allowance, ready to negotiate a surrender that would let him keep my $3 million and his new life with Madison. He severely misunderstood who he was dealing with. I did not reply to his text. Replying is exactly what a desperate person does, and I was not desperate. I put the car in drive and pulled out of the grocery store parking lot. I did not go back to the empty house. I merged onto the highway and drove straight toward downtown Chicago. 40 minutes later, I walked through the sleek glass doors of my corporate restructuring firm. The high-rise office was completely deserted on a weekend. The silence was absolute, save for the faint hum of the server room down the hall. I walked into my corner office overlooking the gray expanse of Lake Michigan and locked the door behind me. I tossed my coat onto the sofa and booted up my multi-monitor workstation. If Bradley wanted to wage a financial war, I was going to bring the battlefield to his front door. I opened a secure browser and stared at the login screen for the enterprise resource planning software used by Bradley's family business. When Bradley and I first met 5 years ago, his century-old printing and packaging company was barely surviving. His father had run the business using antiquated paper ledgers, fragmented spreadsheets, and a complete lack of digital oversight. When Bradley took over as CEO, he was drowning in inefficiencies. He had no idea how to track inventory, manage accounts payable, or audit his own supply chain. I spent the first 2 years of our marriage fixing his mess. I sacrificed my evenings, my weekends, and my holidays, building him a fully integrated digital financial system from the ground up. I migrated decades of messy data into a streamlined cloud architecture. I established the very vendor portals and payment gateways that he was now using to run his company. I did it all for free because he was my husband, and I wanted him to succeed. Bradley was always happy to take the credit for the modernization at his country club dinners, boasting about his brilliant corporate vision, while I sat quietly beside him, sipping my wine. He was incredibly arrogant, and arrogant men are notoriously lazy. Bradley never bothered to understand how the architecture of his own software actually worked. He just liked that it generated pretty charts for his board meetings. Because he never understood the back end, he never thought to revoke the master administrative credentials I created for myself when I built the system. I typed in my old administrator username and password. The system hesitated for a fraction of a second before granting me total unrestricted access to the entire financial nervous system of his company. I bypassed the basic dashboard and dove straight into the raw data logs. I navigated to the vendor master file and pulled up the profile for Horizon Creative Solutions, the Delaware shell company registered to his mistress, Madison. My forensic investigator had already proven that Bradley funneled my $3 million inheritance to this shell company and subsequently wired it to an offshore account in the Cayman Islands. But forensic investigators only see the money leaving the primary corporate account. They do not have super user access to the internal supply chain logs. I did. I started pulling the digital invoices Bradley had approved for Horizon Creative Solutions over the last 6 months. He had coded the payments as premium material procurement and creative logistics consulting. It was a clever way to hide $3 million in a company that routinely bought bulk paper and ink. But as I cross-referenced the procurement orders with the actual warehouse receiving logs, the numbers did not match. The printing business never received a single shipment from Horizon. There were no delivery receipts. There were no freight bills. It was pure phantom billing. I exported the entire batch of fraudulent invoices to a secure external hard drive. This was rock-solid proof of corporate embezzlement. But I did not stop there. In my line of work, you always follow the money until the trail goes completely cold. I accessed the outbound payment registry. I isolated the exact dates and times Bradley authorized the wire transfers to the Cayman Islands. I stared at the ledger, my eyes tracing the columns of data. A distinct pattern began to emerge, one that made my pulse quicken. The total stolen amount was $3 million. But Bradley did not send all $3 million to Madison's offshore account. He sent $2.2 million to the Caymans. The remaining $800,000 was broken up into 4 separate wire transfers of $200,000 each. Those 4 transfers never left the United States. They were routed back into a domestic checking account under the name of a domestic consulting firm called Orchid Strategic Advisory. I opened a new tab on my browser and accessed the Illinois Secretary of State Public Business Database. I searched for Orchid Strategic Advisory. The company was registered to a commercial address in a neighboring suburban district. I pulled the public tax filings and the articles of incorporation. The registered agent and primary shareholder of Orchid Strategic Advisory was a man named Thomas Vance. I sat back in my leather office chair, my eyes locked on the name. Thomas Vance was not a printing supply vendor. He was not a logistics consultant. Thomas Vance was the current head of the Commercial Zoning Board for the exact municipality where Bradley had been desperately trying to build a massive, highly contested new manufacturing warehouse. For the last 2 years, Bradley had been fighting a losing battle with the local city council. His proposed warehouse expansion was repeatedly blocked due to environmental concerns, traffic routing complaints from local residents, and strict zoning restrictions. It was a major point of stress in our marriage. Bradley constantly complained that if he did not get the new warehouse built, his company could not scale to meet modern shipping demands. Then, magically, about 6 months ago, the zoning board suddenly reversed its decision. They approved Bradley's commercial permits with zero public debate and pushed the construction timeline forward. Bradley had celebrated by buying a new vintage sports car, claiming his brilliant negotiating skills had finally won the city council over. He did not win them over. He bought them. He used $800,000 of my grandfather's trust fund to illegally bribe the head of the Commercial Zoning Board through a fake consulting firm. He disguised the bribes as legitimate business expenses, routed the money through his mistress's shell company to wash the trail, and bounced it back stateside into the politician's pocket. I stared at the glowing monitors of my workstation, the magnitude of what I had just uncovered settling heavily over me. Bradley thought this was just a messy divorce. He thought freezing my grocery money was a devastating tactical victory. He thought he was dealing with a scorned wife who would eventually surrender out of financial exhaustion. He had no idea that I had just cracked open a massive criminal conspiracy. Embezzling corporate funds during a divorce was a civil matter, maybe a state-level financial crime if the judge felt particularly vindictive. But utilizing interstate wire transfers to bribe a sitting municipal public official for commercial zoning permits was a direct violation of federal law. It was racketeering. It was felony wire fraud. It was the kind of crime that brought the Federal Bureau of Investigation knocking on your door at 6 a.m. with a battering ram. I had the digital IP logs showing Bradley's specific user credentials, authorizing the transfers. I had the fake invoices from Madison's shell company. I had the routing numbers connecting the stolen trust fund money directly to the public official's hidden business account. I reached out and placed my hand over the external hard drive resting on my desk. The small metal casing felt cold and incredibly heavy. Bradley wanted to play games with my credit cards to starve me out of a legal defense. I did not need a legal defense anymore. I needed a federal prosecutor. I held the absolute destruction of his entire life, his family legacy, and his freedom right in the palm of my hand. I safely ejected the hard drive and slipped it into the inner pocket of my briefcase. I shut down the monitors, leaving the office in darkness once again. I walked out to my car, the cold Chicago air no longer bothering me. Bradley thought he had taken my power. He had just handed me the keys to a federal prison. All I had to do now was decide exactly when to lock him inside. The heavy oak doors of the First Presbyterian Church of Evanston felt colder than usual under my hands, but I pushed them open with a firm, steady push. The Sunday morning air was crisp, and the sunlight streaming through the towering stained glass windows cast long, colorful shadows across the polished stone floors of the vestibule. For the past 5 years, attending this 10 o'clock service was a non-negotiable requirement of being married into Bradley's family. It was a congregation built on old money, generational wealth, and quiet suburban politics. It was also the absolute center of my mother-in-law's social universe. I walked into the sanctuary wearing a perfectly tailored charcoal gray trench coat over a high-necked ivory dress. I did not look like a woman whose husband had just drained her personal bank accounts, nor did I look like a woman who had been legally ambushed 48 hours prior. I looked exactly like what I was. A corporate restructuring consultant, preparing to audit a room full of liabilities. The moment my heels clicked against the marble aisle, I felt the temperature in the room shift. The low, polite murmurs of the gathering congregation faltered. Heads turned. Programs were lowered. In a community like this, news traveled faster than a wire transfer, and Barbara had clearly spent her entire weekend deploying a relentless, calculated smear campaign. When she realized I was not going to fold under the pressure of frozen credit cards or temporary court orders, she pivoted to the only weapon she truly understood: social warfare. I kept my posture straight and my gaze fixed forward as I walked to the pew I had occupied every Sunday for half a decade. The stares from the congregation were icy, filled with a toxic mixture of pity and blatant judgment. As I slid into the wooden bench, the woman sitting in the pew directly in front of me stiffened, gathered her designer purse, and deliberately moved to the opposite side of the aisle. I did not let my expression change. I simply folded my hands in my lap and listened to the whispers bouncing off the vaulted ceilings. People in polite society think they are whispering quietly, but a room full of hushed voices creates a very distinct, unavoidable static. I caught fragments of the narrative Barbara had meticulously seeded throughout her network of country club wives and church elders. I heard the phrase clinically hysterical, murmured by a woman in a floral hat 2 rows back. I heard someone else whisper the word barren, accompanied by a soft, tragic clicking of the tongue. Barbara had painted a masterpiece of suburban fiction. She had told everyone that the pressure of my career had finally driven me to a complete nervous breakdown. She claimed that I was unstable cold and entirely incapable of giving her son the family he so desperately wanted. According to Barbara, Bradley was a tragic suffering martyr who had spent years trying to save our marriage, only to be pushed into the comforting, fertile arms of a loving, younger woman. Madison was being spun not as a home-wrecking mistress, but as a miracle who had rescued Bradley from a toxic, loveless nightmare. It was a brilliantly manipulative strategy. By framing me as clinically hysterical, Barbara was preemptively destroying my credibility. If I tried to tell anyone about the stolen $3 million or the offshore accounts, the congregation would simply nod with sad, knowing eyes and attribute my claims to the paranoid delusions of a bitter, barren ex-wife. She was attempting to shame me out of the pews, out of the community, and out of the fight. I looked toward the front of the sanctuary. Barbara was sitting in the 3rd row, flanked by her closest friends. She was dressed in a pristine navy suit, a string of heavy pearls resting against her collarbone. She slowly turned her head and met my eyes. Her lips curled into a tiny, triumphant smirk. She was waiting for me to break. She wanted me to stand up, burst into tears, and run out of the double doors in humiliation, proving her entire narrative right. Instead, I offered her a polite, entirely unbothered smile, opened my hymnal, and focused on the altar. I sat through the entire hour-long service. I listened to the pastor deliver a sermon about grace, honesty, and the foundation of family. The irony was so thick, it was almost suffocating, but I treated the uncomfortable stares and the cold shoulders the exact same way I treated a hostile board of directors during a corporate buyout. They were just bad data points on a spreadsheet, completely irrelevant to my core objective. When the final hymn concluded and the pastor gave the benediction, the congregation rose to exit toward the fellowship hall for the weekly coffee hour. This was the main event for Barbara. This was where she held court by the silver coffee urns, accepting the sympathetic pats on the arm and the whispered condolences regarding her poor suffering son. I did not follow the crowd into the fellowship hall. I walked in the opposite direction, moving quietly down the carpeted hallway that led toward the administrative wing of the church. I was not there to fight Barbara in the court of public opinion. Arguing with gossip is a waste of capital. If you want to destroy a person's social standing, you do not attack the rumors. You attack the foundation that buys them their seat at the table. In Barbara's case, that foundation was money. I reached the end of the corridor and knocked firmly on the frosted glass door of the small administrative conference room. Without waiting for an answer, I pushed the door open. Sitting at the mahogany table were the two men I had come to see. Richard Sterling, the head of the Elder Board, and William Hayes, the chief church treasurer. Both men were retired financial executives who treated the church's multi-million-dollar operational budget with absolute ruthless precision. They cared deeply about the church's tax-exempt status, its pristine public image, and its financial integrity. They both looked up, clearly startled by my entrance. Richard shifted uncomfortably in his chair, no doubt replaying whatever hysterical narrative Barbara had fed him earlier that morning. Rachel, Richard said, clearing his throat and adjusting his tie. "This is a private administrative meeting. If you are looking for pastoral counseling regarding your marital situation, the pastor's office is down the hall. We have heard that things have been very difficult for you recently." I stepped into the room and closed the door behind me, letting the lock click shut. I did not sit down. I walked directly to the head of the table and looked down at the two men. "I am not here for counseling, Richard," I said, my voice projecting the absolute razor-sharp authority I used in corporate boardrooms. "I am here in my capacity as a financial consultant to offer this institution a very narrow window to avoid a federal subpoena." The condescending pity in William's eyes vanished instantly, replaced by the sharp, alert panic of a seasoned treasurer. "What are you talking about?" William asked, sitting up straight. I reached into my leather briefcase and pulled out a thick, unmarked manila folder. I dropped it onto the center of the mahogany table. The heavy thud made both men flinch. Last month, I began keeping my tone strictly analytical. Bradley made a highly publicized, incredibly generous donation of $50,000 to the church's new youth center expansion fund. It was a donation that resulted in a brass plaque being ordered with the family name, and it earned Barbara a standing ovation during the annual gala. Richard nodded slowly, his brow furrowing. "Yes, the family has always been incredibly generous. It was a cornerstone contribution. I do not see what that has to do with you right now, Rachel." I reached forward and flipped the manila folder open. I spread the printed banking logs and forensic accounting traces across the polished wood so both men could see the highlighted numbers. "That donation was not a charitable gift from a generous family," I explained, tapping my manicured finger against the primary routing document. That $50,000 was processed using a fraudulent corporate credit card tied to an offshore shell company. A shell company that is currently at the center of an active multi-million-dollar embezzlement and federal wire fraud investigation. The color drained from William's face in a matter of seconds. He reached out with a trembling hand and pulled the routing documents closer to him, his eyes scanning the forensic data I had provided. I continued laying out the brutal reality of their situation. Bradley did not just steal money from his own failing business gentleman. He used stolen illicit funds to buy his mother's social status in this church. Under the United States federal tax code, accepting $50,000 in embezzled corporate funds makes this institution a recipient of illicit capital. "That cannot be true," Richard stammered, pulling off his reading glasses and rubbing his face. "Bradley is a pillar of this community. Barbara has been leading the charity committee for a decade. Why would he use a fraudulent card to pay the church? Because his legitimate accounts are entirely leveraged, and he is desperately trying to maintain the illusion of wealth, I answered coldly. But the why does not matter to the Internal Revenue Service. What matters is the paper trail. I have already compiled the evidence of his wire fraud for the federal authorities. When the auditors execute their warrants on Bradley's business, they will trace every single dollar that left those shell accounts. And that trail leads straight into the operating budget of this church. William swallowed hard, looking at the documents as if they were covered in poison. If the IRS traces stolen corporate funds to our building fund, they could freeze our entire operational account pending an investigation. It could jeopardize our nonprofit status entirely. We could be looking at massive civil penalties. Exactly, I said, my voice lowering to a quiet, terrifying calm. The government does not care if you accepted the money in good faith. You are holding stolen assets. You are holding evidence. Richard looked up at me, the reality of the crisis completely overriding whatever gossip he had heard about my mental state. He realized instantly that the woman standing in front of him was not a hysterical, broken housewife. She was an apex predator, holding a financial guillotine over his head. "What do you suggest we do?" Richard asked, his tone now entirely respectful and pleading. I placed my hands on the table, leaning forward just slightly. If I were advising you as a corporate client, I would tell you to immediately quarantine that $50,000 in a separate escrow account. Do not spend a single cent of it. I would then advise you to contact the church's legal counsel first thing tomorrow morning and prepare to self-report the receipt of fraudulent funds to the authorities before they come knocking on your door with a warrant. William nodded frantically, already pulling out his phone to email their lawyers. We will freeze the funds immediately. We have to separate the church from the family trust right now to limit our liability exposure. And one more thing, I added, straightening my posture and buttoning my coat. I highly recommend you reconsider whose names you put on that brass plaque in the new youth center. It is not going to be a good look for the congregation when the man who funded it is indicted for federal racketeering. I closed my briefcase, turned on my heel, and walked out of the administrative conference room without waiting for a response. I left the documents on the table. I left two powerful men in a state of absolute terrified panic. I walked back down the carpeted hallway and stepped into the bustling, noisy fellowship hall. The room was packed with people, holding small ceramic coffee cups and plates of pastries. Across the room, Barbara was standing near the center table holding court. She was surrounded by a tight circle of influential church wives. She had a tissue pressed delicately to her collarbone, playing the devastated stoic mother. She spotted me walking through the hall, and her eyes narrowed. She nudged the woman next to her, preparing to launch another volley of whispered insults as I passed. But before Barbara could open her mouth, the heavy wooden doors of the administrative wing burst open. Richard and William marched into the fellowship hall. They did not look polite. They looked furious. They walked in a straight, aggressive line directly toward Barbara. The crowd of women parted instantly, sensing the sudden, volatile shift in the men's demeanor. Barbara smiled warmly at them, completely oblivious to the financial bomb I had just detonated. "Richard, William," she chimed, her voice projecting across the quieted room. "We were just discussing the gala for the youth wing next month. Bradley is so excited to see the new architectural plans." Richard did not smile back. He looked at Barbara with an expression of pure, unadulterated disgust. "Barbara, I need you to step down from the charity committee immediately," Richard said, his voice loud enough for the entire room to hear. Barbara froze the tissue dropping from her collarbone. "I beg your pardon." Furthermore, William added, crossing his arms over his chest, "The Elder Board is placing an immediate freeze on the funds your son contributed. We will be contacting our legal counsel in the morning regarding the fraudulent nature of the transfer. I suggest you and Bradley secure your own criminal defense attorneys. Do not contact the church office regarding this matter again." The fellowship hall went dead silent. The silence was not the polite hush of Sunday morning prayers. It was the devastating, heavy silence of an empire collapsing in real time. The women who had just been comforting Barbara physically took a step away from her, creating a wide, isolating circle of distance. In their world, a divorce was an unfortunate piece of gossip, but federal fraud and bringing IRS scrutiny to the church's doorstep was an unforgivable radioactive sin. Barbara stood frozen in the center of the room. The smug, entitled mask melted off her face, replaced by an expression of absolute paralyzing horror. Her mouth opened, but she could not find the words to defend herself. She looked around the room, realizing in a matter of seconds that all her social currency had just turned to ash. She locked eyes with me across the hall. I stood by the exit doors. I did not smile. I did not gloat. I gave her one slow, deliberate nod, acknowledging exactly what I had just done. She wanted to destroy my credibility with cheap rumors. I had just destroyed her entire legacy with the truth. I pushed open the double doors and walked out into the crisp Sunday air. The sun had finally broken through the overcast clouds, warming my skin as I walked down the stone steps. The war was escalating, and I was just getting started. The Midwest Heritage Business Gala was the crown jewel of the Chicago corporate social season. It was the kind of event where multi-million-dollar deals were secured over glasses of vintage champagne and polite handshakes. The ballroom at the Drake Hotel was a sea of black tuxedos and designer evening gowns, illuminated by massive crystal chandeliers that cast a warm golden glow over the region's most powerful executives. For Bradley, attending this gala was no longer just a networking opportunity. It was a matter of absolute desperate survival. After I publicly dismantled his mother's social standing at the Presbyterian Church, the family's reputation had gone into a freefall. Barbara was a pariah, and the toxic rumors had begun bleeding into Bradley's corporate life. The printing and packaging business he inherited was hemorrhaging cash. His offshore embezzlement scheme was currently locked in a bureaucratic freeze, and he needed a massive influx of legitimate capital to keep his doors open. He was here tonight to secure a lifeline. I was here to cut it. I stepped out of the sleek black town car and walked into the grand lobby of the hotel. I was wearing a floor-length emerald green silk gown that fit perfectly, projecting an image of untouchable power and control. But the most intimidating part of my ensemble was not my dress. It was the man offering me his arm. Victor Harrington was 68 years old, with sharp silver hair, piercing blue eyes, and a reputation that made grown men sweat in boardrooms. He was a billionaire corporate raider, a man who made his fortune buying distressed companies, gutting their inefficient management teams, and selling off the profitable assets. He was also a former client of mine. 2 years ago, I spent 9 months restructuring an acquired manufacturing firm for him, saving his portfolio $30 million. Our relationship was strictly professional and deeply respectful, but to the outside world, walking into a room on Victor Harrington's arm was the ultimate display of absolute financial dominance. When I called Victor yesterday and asked him to be my +1, he agreed immediately. He despised incompetent CEOs who inherited their wealth, and he had a particular distaste for men who lacked the discipline to manage their own ledgers. He knew exactly what we were here to do, and he was highly entertained by the prospect. We entered the ballroom, and the energy in the room shifted. Heads turned. Victor was a titan, and my presence beside him sparked a wildfire of whispered speculation. I kept my head high, scanning the crowd with the practiced eye of a predator assessing a feeding ground. It took me exactly 2 minutes to find my target. Bradley was standing near the center of the room by an elaborate ice sculpture. He was wearing his custom tuxedo, holding a glass of scotch, and laughing with a forced, desperate kind of energy. Standing right next to him, clinging tightly to his arm, was Madison. This was their grand public debut as a couple. Madison was wearing a tight black sequined dress that prominently displayed her pregnancy. She was glowing with the smug satisfaction of a woman who believed she had just secured a permanent seat in the upper echelon of high society. She scanned the room, clearly loving the attention, until her eyes met mine. Her smug smile vanished, instantly replaced by a flash of genuine panic. She leaned in and whispered frantically to Bradley. Bradley turned his head, spotting me and Victor. I watched his posture stiffen. The color drained from his face as he recognized the billionaire titan standing protectively by my side. But my eyes were not on Bradley's panicked expression. My eyes were locked entirely on the base of Madison's throat. Resting against her collarbone, glittering under the ballroom lights, was a vintage platinum-set diamond pendant. It was a stunning, irreplaceable piece of Art Deco jewelry. It was also my grandmother's necklace. When I moved my personal belongings out of our shared home to protect them from Bradley's financial manipulation, the necklace was missing from my jewelry box. When I confronted him about it via email, Bradley claimed the moving company must have lost it in the transition. He swore he had filed a police report for the missing item. He did not lose it. He stole a priceless family heirloom from his wife to decorate the neck of his pregnant 25-year-old mistress for a corporate gala. A cold, lethal fury settled in my chest. Emotion is a liability in business, but directed anger is an incredible fuel. I placed my hand on Victor's arm. "Do you see the man standing by the ice sculpture?" "Victor," I asked quietly, "the one sweating through his tuxedo while his date wears stolen property?" Victor replied, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "I see him. He looks incredibly overleveraged. He is trying to corner Thomas Caldwell for the regional distribution contract." I noted watching Bradley eagerly gesture toward a tall, older gentleman who was approaching their circle. Caldwell Packaging Logistics is the largest distributor in the Midwest. If Bradley lands a multi-year contract with Caldwell tonight, the cash advance will be enough to cover his payroll and float his debt covenants for another 6 months. Victor smiled a sharp, predatory expression. "Then we should probably go say hello to Thomas. He and I sit on the board of the symphony together. It would be rude of me not to introduce him to my brilliant restructuring consultant." We walked across the ballroom with slow, deliberate steps. The crowd naturally parted for Victor, giving us a clear, unobstructed path directly to Bradley's circle. As we approached, I could hear Bradley pitching his company's capabilities, his voice slightly too loud, slightly too eager. "Thomas, I can guarantee you that our printing facilities have the highest volume capacity in the state," Bradley was saying, gesturing with his Scotch glass. "If we lock in this exclusivity deal tonight, we can scale your packaging operations by 20% in the first quarter alone. We are fully capitalized and ready to expand." Thomas Caldwell, a shrewd and pragmatic businessman, nodded slowly, swirling the wine in his glass. "It sounds promising, Bradley. But in this current economic climate, I need absolute assurance that my partners have bulletproof supply chains. I cannot afford to link my distribution network to a manufacturer that might face sudden liquidity issues." Before Bradley could offer another fabricated assurance, Victor stepped smoothly into the circle, placing a firm hand on Caldwell's shoulder. "Thomas, it is good to see you," Victor said, his booming voice commanding the immediate attention of everyone in the vicinity. Victor Caldwell replied, his face lighting up with genuine respect as he shook the billionaire's hand. "I did not know you were attending tonight." "I rarely do," Victor said smoothly, "but I am here escorting my favorite financial strategist." "Thomas, I do not believe you have formally met Rachel. She is the genius who restructured my acquisitions last year." Caldwell turned to me, his eyes widening with immediate professional recognition. "Rachel, of course. Your work on the merger was legendary in the sector. It is an absolute pleasure to finally meet you in person. The pleasure is entirely mine, Thomas," I said, shaking his hand with a firm, confident grip. I completely ignored Bradley and Madison, treating them as if they were invisible background fixtures. Bradley was practically vibrating with panicked energy. He shifted his weight, trying to reassert his presence in the conversation. "Thomas, as I was saying about the expansion capital," Bradley interjected, his voice tight. I turned my head very slowly and looked at Bradley. I let my eyes drift down to Madison, staring directly at my grandmother's diamond necklace resting on her chest. Madison shrank back, pulling her shawl tighter around her shoulders, her face flushing a deep, humiliated crimson. "Expansion capital is a fascinating subject, Bradley," I said, my voice projecting clearly so that several nearby executives paused their own conversations to listen. "Thomas, you mentioned earlier that you require partners with bulletproof supply chains and total liquidity." "I do." Caldwell agreed, looking between me and Bradley, sensing the sudden, sharp shift in the atmosphere. Then I am sure Bradley has already disclosed the upcoming debt covenant breach his printing company is facing at the end of this month, I said, keeping my tone perfectly conversational, as if we were discussing the weather. Bradley choked on his breath. "Rachel, that is confidential corporate information?" He hissed, his face turning an alarming shade of gray. "Actually, Bradley, it is a matter of public record, if you know where to look," I corrected him smoothly. "Thomas, any thorough due diligence will show that his printing firm is currently operating at a dangerous debt-to-equity ratio. Last quarter, they failed to meet their primary revenue targets. To cover the shortfall, the company took out a highly toxic mezzanine loan, using their primary manufacturing equipment as collateral." Caldwell's expression hardened instantly. He turned to Bradley, his eyes narrowing. "You leveraged your primary equipment. Rachel is exaggerating." "Thomas," Bradley stammered desperately, trying to salvage the conversation. "We just executed a temporary restructuring of our assets. It is completely standard. It is standard for a company preparing to file for bankruptcy," I countered ruthlessly. "Furthermore, their primary supply chain is entirely compromised. Last week, a massive municipal zoning violation surfaced regarding their new warehouse facility. The resulting fines and legal fees have completely depleted their operational cash reserves. If you sign an exclusivity contract with them tonight, Thomas, you are not scaling your operations. You are tying your distribution network to a sinking ship that will likely cease operations before the end of the fiscal year." Bradley stepped forward, his face contorted with absolute fury. "You have absolutely no right to interfere with my business deals, Rachel. You are a bitter, scorned woman trying to ruin my life because I moved on." I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice. I simply looked at Caldwell. "Thomas, I am a restructuring consultant," I said calmly. "I read financial liabilities for a living. I highly recommend you have your internal auditors pull the Uniform Commercial Code filings on his corporate assets tomorrow morning. You will see the liens for yourself. Do not sign a single document with him." Thomas Caldwell was a man who survived in business by avoiding unnecessary risks. He looked at Bradley, taking in the sweat beading on his forehead, the desperate panic in his eyes, and the young, terrified woman clinging to his arm. Then he looked at Victor Harrington, who was watching the execution with a look of profound, silent approval. Bradley Caldwell said, his voice cold and final, "I think it is best if we put a complete hold on all contract negotiations. My firm cannot expose itself to this level of financial instability. I will not be moving forward with your company." Caldwell set his wine glass down on a passing waiter's tray, nodded respectfully to me and Victor, and walked away without another word. Bradley stood frozen, staring at the empty space where his multi-million-dollar lifeline had just vanished. His breathing was shallow and ragged. The executive standing nearby had heard the entire exchange, and the whispers were already spreading through the ballroom like a virus. The CEO of the century-old printing company was functionally bankrupt. He turned to me, his eyes wide with a terrifying, helpless rage. "You just killed my company," he whispered, his voice shaking. "That contract was the only way I could make payroll next week. You just destroyed everything." I stepped closer to him, invading his space just enough to make him instinctively lean back. "You destroyed everything the moment you stole my money and tried to throw me out of my own home." I replied, my voice a quiet, lethal blade. "I am just balancing the ledgers." I turned my attention to Madison, who was visibly shaking, one hand resting on her pregnant belly, the other nervously touching the diamond pendant at her throat. "Madison," I said, offering her a chilling, perfectly polite smile. "That is a truly stunning necklace. The Art Deco platinum setting is very distinctive. It belonged to my grandmother. She wore it on her wedding day." On her. Madison gasped, her hand dropping from the diamonds as if the stones had suddenly caught fire. She looked at Bradley in absolute horror. "You told me you bought this for me," she whimpered. "You said it was vintage from a boutique." "He is a liar and a thief, Madison," I told her calmly. "And you are publicly wearing stolen property in a room full of federal corporate lawyers. I highly suggest you take it off and return it to my office by tomorrow morning, or my next conversation will be with the police regarding the possession of stolen goods." I did not wait for her response. I turned away from the ashes of Bradley's corporate reputation and placed my hand back on Victor's arm. "Shall we get a drink, Victor?" I asked smoothly. "I believe we shall," Rachel Victor replied, leading me away toward the bar. That was the most efficient corporate assassination I have ever had the pleasure of witnessing. We walked through the ballroom, leaving Bradley and Madison standing alone by the ice sculpture, completely isolated in a sea of wealthy executives who now knew exactly how toxic they were. Bradley had tried to secure his public image. Instead, I had ensured that no reputable business in the Midwest would ever sign a contract with him again. His cash flow was dead, and the real financial suffocation was about to begin. In the world of corporate restructuring, there is a fundamental and unforgiving truth that inexperienced business owners almost never understand. A company does not die when it stops being profitable. A company dies when it can no longer make payroll. You can lose your biggest client. You can suffer a massive drop in your quarterly earnings, and you can even survive a devastating public relations scandal. But the absolute second you fail to issue paychecks to the people running your warehouse floor, your business goes into an unrecoverable freefall. The union files immediate grievances. The machine operators walk off the line, the delivery drivers leave the trucks parked in the lot, and your entire supply chain grinds to a violent, irreversible halt. After Thomas Caldwell publicly humiliated Bradley at the Midwest Heritage Business Gala and pulled his regional distribution contract, Bradley was entirely out of options. That contract was his only remaining bridge to secure a short-term cash advance. Without it, he was staring down the barrel of a massive bi-weekly payroll deadline that he simply could not meet. His corporate accounts were overdrawn, his credit lines were maxed out, and the walls of his century-old printing and packaging business were rapidly closing in on him. I sat in the quiet sanctuary of my downtown office on a Tuesday morning, sipping a cup of hot Earl Grey tea and looking out over the city skyline. I knew exactly what Bradley was going to do next. He was a creature of predictable, desperate habits. When an arrogant man runs out of legitimate options, he immediately turns to his hidden reserves. Bradley had $3 million of my stolen inheritance sitting in an offshore bank account in the Cayman Islands, safely tucked away under the name of Madison's shell corporation, Horizon Creative Solutions. He firmly believed that money was his ultimate safety net. I knew that by Wednesday morning, he would attempt to repatriate those funds. He would try to wire a massive chunk of that stolen money back into his domestic corporate accounts, just to float his payroll and keep his printing presses running for another month. He thought he could just log into a secure portal, click a few buttons, and move the money back into his hands. He severely underestimated the financial trap I had spent the last 72 hours building around him. The morning after I discovered his embezzlement, I had sat down with my lead litigation attorney and an expert in international banking law. I did not just want to sue Bradley for the money in civil court, because civil litigation takes years. By the time a family court judge issued a ruling, Bradley and Madison could easily drain the offshore account and disappear. I needed a tactical nuclear strike on his liquidity. We used the forensic accounting report I had generated compiling the fake invoices, the digital IP logs, showing Bradley authorizing the transfers and the shell company registration, proving Madison was the proxy. We took that mountain of evidence and filed an immediate Uniform Commercial Code lien against Horizon Creative Solutions. A Uniform Commercial Code lien is a legal notice filed by a creditor that signals they have a legal right to the property of a debtor. But I did not stop there. We escalated the matter far beyond a simple domestic dispute. Because Bradley had moved the money across international borders, using fraudulent pretexts, we filed an emergency federal freeze on the Cayman Islands account, invoking international anti-money laundering statutes and federal wire fraud regulations. When you alert a global financial institution that an account in their jurisdiction is currently holding funds actively tied to a United States federal racketeering and embezzlement investigation, the bank does not hesitate. Banks are terrified of losing their international charters and facing multi-billion-dollar compliance fines from the federal government. They act immediately to protect their own liability. The bank in the Cayman Islands instantly locked Madison's shell account. They did not just pause the transfers, they placed the entire $3 million into a bureaucratic, legal purgatory. The funds were completely frozen, inaccessible to anyone, until a federal investigation could be fully concluded, a process that usually takes years to untangle. Bradley was completely cut off, and he did not even know it yet. At exactly 1 o'clock on Wednesday afternoon, I decided to pay a visit to the headquarters of Bradley's printing and packaging company. I had a perfectly legitimate reason to be there. I had given Madison a strict 24-hour deadline to return my grandmother's Art Deco diamond necklace, threatening police involvement if she failed to comply. She had not returned my calls or brought the necklace to my attorney, so I was going to collect my stolen property in person. I parked my car in the visitor lot and walked toward the massive brick building that had housed Bradley's family business for 3 generations. The smell of industrial ink, heated cardboard, and heavy machinery hung thick in the air. This was a place built by his hardworking grandfather, a man who would be absolutely disgusted to see how his grandson was running the empire into the ground. I pushed through the heavy glass double doors and stepped into the main corporate lobby. The atmosphere inside the building was chaotic and suffocatingly tense. The receptionist behind the front desk looked pale and frantic, fielding 3 different ringing telephone lines at once. Delivery drivers were standing near the entrance, holding clipboards and arguing aggressively with lower-level managers about unpaid freight invoices. The entire company felt like a ship taking on water. I walked toward the reception desk, my heels clicking sharply against the polished concrete floor. The receptionist looked up, recognizing me instantly. Her eyes widened with a mixture of relief and panic. "Rachel," she breathed, lowering her headset. "I am so sorry, things are completely out of control here today. Half our suppliers have put us on a credit hold." I offered her a polite, calming smile. "It is all right, Sarah. I am not here to cause any trouble for you. I am just here to collect a personal item from Madison." "Is she in the building?" Sarah nodded quickly, gesturing toward the executive suite at the end of the long hallway. "She is in Bradley's office. They have been in there with the door locked all morning. Honestly, Rachel, it has been awful. Bradley has been screaming on the phone for the last hour." I thanked her and bypassed the waiting area, walking deliberately down the carpeted corridor toward the glass-walled executive suite. As I approached, the muffled sounds of a frantic argument grew louder and clearer. I stopped just outside the heavy oak door of the CEO's office, standing perfectly still in the hallway. The door was slightly ajar, allowing me to hear every single word of the meltdown happening inside. "What do you mean the account is flagged for compliance?" Bradley was yelling, his voice cracking with a high-pitched, desperate panic. "That is a private wealth management account. You cannot just lock my funds. I am the primary beneficiary. I need a wire transfer of $500,000 processed to my domestic commercial account immediately." There was a brief silence as the international banker on the other end of the phone spoke. Then Bradley slammed his fist down on his heavy mahogany desk so hard, the sound echoed out into the hallway. "Wire fraud." Bradley screamed, the sheer terror in his voice unmistakable. "Who reported it for wire fraud? I submitted all the necessary corporate invoices. The transfers were completely legitimate payments for logistics consulting." I stood in the hallway, feeling a profound, icy satisfaction settle deep into my bones. He was finally hitting the invisible wall I had built around him. Inside the office, Madison was pacing back and forth in front of the window. She was wearing a tight cashmere sweater, her arms crossed defensively over her pregnant belly. "You need to fix this right now, Bradley," she snapped, her usually sweet, bubbly voice turning sharp and incredibly grating. "That account is in my name. If the federal authorities are looking at it, they are going to come after my shell company. You promised me that money was safe. You promised me I would be protected." "I'm trying to fix it." "Madison." Bradley snapped back, clearly losing his temper. "But the bank compliance officer will not authorize the release. They said there is a uniform commercial code lien and an international asset freeze placed on the portfolio. Someone tipped them off." Madison stopped pacing and stared at him, her face twisting with sudden furious realization. It was Rachel, she yelled, her voice echoing loudly through the executive suite. She told you at the house that she knew about the account. She warned us. She locked the money, Bradley. I did not move from my spot in the hallway. Several employees had stepped out of their nearby cubicles, their eyes wide as they listened to the CEO and the new creative director screaming at each other about frozen offshore accounts and wire fraud. Bradley's meticulously crafted image as a brilliant in-control leader was disintegrating in front of his own staff. Bradley hung up the phone, the sound of the receiver slamming into the base ringing out sharply. He ran both hands through his hair, tugging at the roots, his chest heaving. Madison, I need you to calm down. I just need to call our corporate attorneys. We can get the freeze lifted. We just need to prove the funds were moved for legitimate tax restructuring purposes. You cannot prove anything, Madison shrieked, taking a step toward his desk. It was a fake company, Bradley. You used my name on a fake company to steal $3 million from your wife. You told me it was foolproof. You told me we would have millions of dollars waiting for us in the Caymans so we could start our own life. Now the money is gone and the federal government has my signature on a fraudulent incorporation document. The ugly, desperate truth was finally out in the open, and the illusion of their perfect romantic love affair shattered into a million pieces right there in his office. Madison did not love Bradley because he was a charming, misunderstood man trapped in a cold marriage. She loved the $3 million she thought he had successfully stolen for her. Now that the money was locked in a legal vault, she was looking at him not as a wealthy savior, but as a sinking anchor who was about to drag her down into a federal indictment. I am not going to jail for you, Bradley, Madison cried out, tears of genuine panic streaming down her face. If my name is on that account, they are going to arrest me. You need to transfer money from the business to pay for my defense lawyer right now. I do not have any money in the business, Madison Bradley roared back, finally losing the last shred of his composure. Do you not understand what is happening here? I have a payroll run on Friday that requires $400,000 in liquid cash, and my operating account has less than $12,000 in it. My vendors have cut off my credit. Thomas Caldwell backed out of our distribution deal. I cannot pay for your lawyer, and I cannot pay my employees. The company is completely broke. The sheer volume of his confession paralyzed the hallway. The employees standing near the cubicles exchanged terrified, devastating looks. They had just heard their CEO admit that they were not getting paid on Friday and that the company was functionally bankrupt. Madison let out a loud, hysterical sob. You lied to me, she screamed, grabbing a heavy glass paperweight off the edge of his desk and hurling it across the room. The glass shattered violently against the far wall. You told me you were a millionaire. You told me Rachel was just a bitter consultant holding you back. You are nothing without her money. You are completely ruined. Bradley's face contorted with rage. He took a threatening step toward her, pointing a finger directly in her face. Do not push me right now, Madison. I ruined my marriage for you. I risked my entire family legacy to set up that account for our future. Do not act like you were not perfectly happy spending her money when you thought we got away with it. I decided I had heard enough. The performance had reached its tragic, pathetic climax, and it was time for me to collect my property and leave them to burn in the fire they had started. I pushed the heavy oak door open and stepped into the executive office. The screaming stopped instantly. Bradley and Madison both froze, turning to look at me as if a ghost had just walked into the room. Bradley looked utterly defeated. His tie loosened his shirt, wrinkled his eyes bloodshot and wide with panic. Madison was hyperventilating, her mascara running down her cheeks in dark, messy streaks. I did not look at Bradley. I focused entirely on the young, terrified woman standing near the window. I walked slowly across the plush carpet, stopping just a few feet away from her. I believe you have something that belongs to me, Madison, I said, my voice cutting through the heavy, toxic air of the office with absolute chilling precision. I gave you 24 hours to return my grandmother's necklace. Your time is up. Madison trembled, her hand instinctively rising to cover the bare skin of her collarbone. She was not wearing the necklace today. She looked at Bradley silently, begging him to intervene to protect her, to do something. But Bradley just stood there, completely paralyzed by the reality of his own destruction. He had no power left. It is in my purse, Madison whispered, her voice barely audible. She slowly backed away from me, moving toward the small leather designer handbag resting on a side table. She unzipped it with shaking hands, reached inside, and pulled out the brilliant vintage platinum diamond pendant. She held it out to me, her eyes cast down toward the floor, unable to look me in the face. I reached out and took the necklace, letting the heavy, cool platinum settle into the palm of my hand. I inspected the clasp, ensuring none of the diamonds had been damaged. I carefully slipped it into the inner pocket of my tailored coat. "Thank you," I said smoothly. I turned on my heel and walked back toward the door. I paused just as my hand touched the brass handle. I looked back over my shoulder at my husband, the man who had promised to love and protect me, the man who was currently standing in the ruins of a century-old legacy that he had destroyed with his own greed. "Check your mail tomorrow, Bradley," I told him calmly. The bank foreclosure on the house was just the beginning. The federal authorities are going to have a lot of questions about those municipal zoning permits next. I suggest you both retain excellent criminal defense counsel. I hear they require very large liquid cash retainers. I opened the door and walked out of the executive suite, leaving the door wide open behind me. As I walked back down the hallway, the employees parted for me, stepping aside with a mixture of awe and absolute terror. I did not look back as I pushed through the front doors and stepped out into the bright, crisp afternoon sunlight. The supply chain was fully squeezed, the oxygen was cut off, and the ultimate suffocation of Bradley's empire had officially begun. It took exactly 48 hours for the reality of poverty to break Madison. When a woman builds her entire future on the illusion of stolen wealth, the sudden evaporation of that money does not just break her heart. It shatters her loyalty completely. Bradley had promised her a life of endless luxury private jets and offshore accounts. Now he was facing imminent bankruptcy, missed payrolls, and a looming federal investigation. Madison realized very quickly that she was tethered to a sinking ship, and rats always abandon a sinking ship the absolute second the water touches their feet. I knew she would panic. I just did not realize how criminally stupid her exit strategy would be. I was sitting at my kitchen island reviewing the municipal zoning files when my phone rang. The caller ID showed the name Gregory Evans. Gregory was the chief operating officer of Apex Packaging, which was the largest direct competitor to Bradley's printing business in the Midwest. 3 years ago, I orchestrated a highly complex merger for Apex, saving Gregory's executive team from a hostile takeover. We maintained a very mutually beneficial professional relationship. I answered the phone, expecting a casual networking catch-up. Instead, Gregory handed me the final nail in my husband's coffin. "Rachel," Gregory said, his voice dropping low, sounding almost amused. "I just received a very interesting phone call from a young woman claiming to be the creative director over at your husband's printing firm." She sounded frantic. "She offered to sell me a master flash drive containing Bradley's entire proprietary client list, his upcoming pricing models, and all the unpatented intellectual property for their new packaging schematics. She asked for $500,000 in unmarked cash. She wants to meet me at the Palmer House Hotel lobby this afternoon to make the exchange." I closed my laptop, a cold, sharp smile spreading across my face. Madison was attempting corporate espionage. She was trying to steal Bradley's most valuable trade secrets to secure a golden parachute so she could flee the inevitable legal fallout. It was a desperate, highly illegal move. Gregory Flipper said, leaning back in my chair, "You and I both know that purchasing stolen intellectual property is a federal crime." "I would never touch it," Gregory replied smoothly. "Which is why I am calling you." I told her I would send a senior representative with the cash to verify the data at 3 o'clock. "I thought you might want to be that representative." I thanked Gregory, promising him a bottle of 20-year-old scotch for his loyalty. I hung up the phone and walked straight into my home office. I did not have $500,000 in cash, and I certainly had no intention of paying my husband's mistress a single cent. But I had something far more valuable to bring to the meeting. I sat at my desk and drafted a highly specific, legally binding document. It was a sworn affidavit. In the document, I detailed the exact timeline of the $3 million embezzlement. I outlined how Bradley manipulated the corporate accounts, how he directed the creation of the shell company, and how he orchestrated the bribes to the municipal zoning board. I worded the affidavit very carefully to position Bradley as the sole mastermind of the criminal enterprise. The document explicitly framed Madison as a naive, manipulated employee who merely followed the direct orders of her superior. It was her only legal lifeline. I printed the document, slid it into a crisp leather folder, and called for a town car. The Palmer House Hotel lobby is a sprawling, opulent masterpiece of painted ceilings, velvet armchairs, and dim golden lighting. It is the perfect place for wealthy tourists to have afternoon tea and a terrible place to conduct a felony transaction. I arrived 10 minutes early and stood near a massive marble pillar scanning the room. I spotted Madison immediately. She was sitting in a secluded corner booth, clutching a small designer handbag against her pregnant belly. She looked absolutely terrified. The smug, entitled arrogance she had displayed in my foyer just days ago was completely gone. Her hair was pulled back into a messy knot, and she was anxiously biting her lower lip, checking her phone every 10 seconds. She was a 25-year-old girl playing a very dangerous game with men who would gladly watch her burn. I walked slowly across the patterned carpet, my heels making no sound. I did not announce my presence until I was standing directly over her table. Madison looked up, expecting to see a corporate buyer carrying a briefcase full of cash. When her eyes registered my face, she let out a sharp, choked gasp, recoiling so hard she nearly spilled her glass of water. "Rachel," she stammered, her voice shaking violently. "What are you doing here? How did you know I was here?" I slid smoothly into the velvet armchair directly across from her. I placed my leather folder on the low mahogany table between us. "Gregory Evans sends his regards, Madison. He also sends his apologies. He is not in the business of purchasing stolen intellectual property from desperate mistresses." Madison's face turned the color of ash. She instinctively pulled her handbag closer to her chest, her knuckles turning white. "I do not know what you are talking about," she whispered, her eyes darting frantically toward the lobby exit. "I am just here having a drink." "You are here to commit corporate espionage, Madison," I said, my voice quiet, calm, and absolutely lethal. "You have a flash drive in that bag containing Bradley's proprietary client list and operational schematics. You offered to sell it for $500,000 in cash so you could buy a plane ticket and disappear before the federal authorities indict you for wire fraud." Madison started to cry. It was not a performative, manipulative cry. It was the raw, ugly sobbing of a person who finally realized they were trapped in a cage with no exit. "Please," Rachel Madison begged, leaning forward, tears streaming down her face. "You have to understand. Bradley lied to me. He told me the money was clean. He told me we were going to the Cayman Islands to start a new life. Now he has no money, the company is failing, and he expects me to just sit there and take the fall for the offshore account. I am pregnant. I cannot go to jail." "He ruined my life. He ruined his own life, Madison. You were just a willing participant. As long as the credit cards worked," I replied coldly. Stealing his trade secrets to sell to a competitor is a violation of the Economic Espionage Act. It carries a penalty of up to 10 years in federal prison. If I call the FBI right now and tell them what is in your purse, you will not just give birth in a federal penitentiary. You will raise your child through a plexiglass window. Madison covered her face with her hands, sobbing so hard her shoulders shook. "I do not want to go to jail," she gasped. "Please just let me walk away. I will leave the state. I will never speak to him again. I will do whatever you want." I opened the leather folder on the table and pushed the sworn affidavit toward her along with a heavy silver pen. "I am offering you a choice, Madison. I am offering you the only lifeline you are going to get. You are going to sign this affidavit. You are going to swear under penalty of perjury that Bradley was the sole architect of the embezzlement. You are going to testify that he used his authority as CEO to coerce you into opening the shell corporation and that he orchestrated the municipal bribes. You will give me the sworn proof I need to bury him permanently." Madison stared at the document through her tears. "If I sign this, Bradley will go to prison," she whispered. "He is going to prison regardless," I told her without a shred of pity. "The only question today is whether he is going alone or whether you are going with him. If you sign this document, you become a cooperating witness. You become the manipulated employee. You can walk out of this hotel, get in your car, and disappear. But if you refuse, I will flag down that security guard by the door, and I will have the police search your bag for stolen corporate property. Decide right now." Madison did not hesitate for another second. Her self-preservation instinct completely overrode whatever remaining loyalty she had to the man who ruined my marriage. She picked up the silver pen with a trembling hand and signed her name at the bottom of the affidavit, betraying Bradley entirely to save her own skin. I took the document, closed the folder, and stood up, leaving her sobbing alone in the lobby. The mistress had cracked, and Bradley was officially a dead man walking. When a man is backed into a corner of his own making, his true nature is completely exposed. Bradley had spent his entire life insulated by family wealth, relying on his charming smile and his century-old legacy to solve his problems. He had never faced genuine, terrifying consequence. Now his company was days away from a catastrophic payroll default. His regional distribution contract was publicly dead. His offshore account holding my stolen $3 million was locked tightly in an international legal freeze. He was drowning, and he was grasping at absolutely anything that could keep him afloat. He had no idea that his fragile life raft had already been destroyed. He did not know that Madison, the pregnant mistress he sacrificed our marriage for, had sat across from me in a hotel lobby just 24 hours ago and signed a sworn affidavit betraying him entirely to save herself. Bradley still believed he could win. He still believed he was the smartest person in the room. That blinding, arrogant delusion was exactly what I needed him to feel, because an arrogant man does not look down to see the trap waiting beneath his feet. With his legitimate credit lines maxed out and traditional banks refusing to return his calls, Bradley was forced to turn to the shadow banking sector. He attempted to secure a mezzanine loan. In the world of corporate finance, a mezzanine loan is the absolute loan of last resort. It is a highly toxic, high-interest financial instrument that lenders only issue when they can secure an ironclad, highly liquid asset as collateral. If the borrower defaults, the lender immediately seizes the collateral without having to go through a lengthy bankruptcy court process. Bradley needed $500,000 in cash by Friday to cover his employees' paychecks and keep the warehouse doors open. But his printing presses already had liens against them. His commercial real estate was heavily mortgaged. He had absolutely no clean corporate assets left to pledge, so he decided to steal mine. During the 5 years of our marriage, I managed our joint tax filings. However, Bradley kept digital copies of all our historical financial documents on his home office hard drive. He had access to my social security number, my personal brokerage account details, and the routing numbers for my independent investment portfolios. Those portfolios contained the wealth I had built entirely on my own, completely separate from the grandfather's trust fund he had already embezzled. Bradley formulated a plan born out of pure criminal desperation. He filled out the extensive application for the mezzanine loan, listing his failing printing company as the primary borrower. But to satisfy the ruthless private lenders, he added a personal guarantor. He listed my name. He pledged my private independent brokerage accounts as the sole collateral for his corporate debt. He intended to forge my signature on the digital application and the final loan documents. He assumed I would never find out until it was too late. He thought that because we were still legally married on paper, the private lender would simply process the spousal guarantor forms without a second glance. He believed he could secure the $500,000, float his company for another month, and deal with the fallout later. He was incredibly wrong. When I initiated my financial retaliation against him weeks ago, I did not just freeze my debit cards and secure my home. I used my expertise as a corporate consultant to completely lock down my financial identity. I placed a maximum security fraud alert on my social security number across all 3 major credit bureaus. I initiated a direct notification protocol with every financial institution that held my assets. If anyone attempted to open a credit line, secure a loan, or pledge my accounts as collateral, the transaction would instantly trigger an automated high-priority compliance hold. I was sitting at my dining room table on a quiet Thursday morning, reviewing legal briefs when my cell phone rang. The caller ID displayed the corporate headquarters for First Continental Bank, a prominent commercial lender in downtown Chicago. I answered the phone with a calm, steady voice. "Good morning," Am I speaking with Rachel? A professional, slightly nervous male voice asked. This is Rachel, I replied. My name is Jonathan, and I am a senior compliance officer with First Continental Bank, the man said. I am calling regarding an urgent security flag on a commercial loan application submitted yesterday evening. The application lists you as the primary financial guarantor for a mezzanine loan requested by a commercial printing and packaging company. The loan is for $500,000, and it pledges your personal brokerage portfolio as the securing collateral. I took a slow sip of my coffee, feeling a sharp, thrilling rush of adrenaline pump through my veins. Bradley had actually done it. He had crossed the line from a messy civil divorce dispute into the realm of a serious, undeniable felony. Jonathan, I said, keeping my tone perfectly measured. I am currently going through a highly contested divorce with the chief executive officer of that printing company. I have not authorized any loan applications. I have not signed any guarantor agreements. Any document submitted to your bank bearing my signature is a complete forgery. There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. The compliance officer instantly understood the gravity of the situation. A forged signature on a commercial loan application meant the bank was actively being targeted for fraud. I am so sorry, Rachel Jonathan said, his professional demeanor shifting into high alert. We will cancel the application immediately. We will freeze the corporate profile and alert our internal fraud department to reject the file. No, I interrupted smoothly. Do not cancel the application. Do not reject it. Jonathan paused clearly, confused by my instruction. I do not understand. If this is a fraudulent application, we are legally required to stop the processing. You are legally required to prevent the distribution of funds, I corrected him. But if you simply reject the digital application right now, my husband will just take his forged documents to another shadow lender who might not have the same rigorous compliance standards as First Continental Bank. He will keep trying until he steals my assets. We need to stop him permanently. What are you suggesting we do? Jonathan asked cautiously. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the dining table. Submitting a fraudulent digital application is a crime, but it is often difficult for prosecutors to prove who actually clicked the submit button on a home computer. A defense lawyer could argue his secretary did it or claim it was a clerical error. We need to completely eliminate any possibility of reasonable doubt. I outlined my plan to the compliance officer. I instructed him to approve the initial phase of the loan application. I told him to call Bradley and inform him that the $500,000 funds were ready to be released, but with one minor administrative condition. Because of the high value of the collateral, the bank required the final guarantor documents to be signed in person physically at the main downtown branch. Jonathan was silent for a long moment as he processed the legal strategy. If he comes into the branch and physically signs a fraudulent document in front of a bank officer, he said slowly, that elevates the action significantly. Yes, it does. I confirmed. Forging a spouse's name on a local car loan is a state-level offense, but walking into a federally insured financial institution and knowingly signing a forged document to secure a $500,000 commercial loan is federal bank fraud. It is a direct violation of United States Code Title 18. It carries a maximum penalty of 30 years in a federal penitentiary. I will need to clear this with my branch manager and our legal department, Jonathan said, his voice betraying a hint of awe. But since we are protecting the bank from liability and assisting in the prevention of a major financial crime, I am confident they will cooperate. They will cooperate, I assured him. Call him. Set the appointment for tomorrow morning. Tell him the funds will be wired to his payroll account by noon if he signs the paperwork at 10 o'clock. I ended the call and set my phone down on the table. A profound, icy calm settled over my entire house. Bradley was so desperate to save his fragile ego and his failing company that he was willing to sacrifice my entire future. He thought he could steal the wealth I had built with my own hands to fund a lavish lifestyle with a woman who had already sold him out to save herself. He was about to learn a terrifying lesson about consequences. The next morning, the sky over Chicago was a brilliant, clear blue. I drove downtown and parked my car in a parking garage directly across the street from the First Continental Bank headquarters. I sat in the driver's seat, leaving the engine off, and watched the heavy revolving glass doors of the bank entrance. At exactly 9:45, Bradley's luxury sports car pulled up to the curb. He parked in a loading zone, clearly too frantic to look for a proper parking spot. He stepped out of the car, and I could see the heavy toll the last few weeks had taken on him. His usually pristine suit was wrinkled, his shoulders were slumped, and he was anxiously checking his phone. He looked like a man walking to his own execution, completely unaware that the executioner was watching him from across the street. I pulled out my phone and dialed the direct number for Jonathan, the compliance officer. "He just walked through the front doors," I said. "We see him." Jonathan replied, his voice a low whisper. "My branch manager is bringing him into conference room B." I knew exactly what conference room B looked like. It was standard practice for major financial institutions to equip their high-value closing rooms with state-of-the-art security technology. I knew that nestled discreetly in the ceiling corners of that room were high-definition 4K resolution security cameras. They recorded both video and crystal-clear audio. Every single movement, every single word, and every single stroke of the pen would be captured and stored on a secure server. Jonathan kept the phone line open, allowing me to listen to the trap snapping shut in real time. I heard the heavy wooden door of the conference room click shut. I heard the muffled, polite greetings exchanged between Bradley and the branch manager. Mr. Evans, the branch manager, said, his tone perfectly professional. "We have the final guarantor forms right here." As we discussed on the phone, this document legally pledges Rachel Evans' personal brokerage portfolio as the securing collateral for the $500,000 commercial loan. "I understand," Bradley replied. His voice sounded tight, strained by the sheer anxiety of his lie. "Rachel could not be here today. She is traveling for work, but she reviewed the documents digitally and authorized me to sign as her legal proxy." That was the fatal lie. He had just stated his fraudulent intent out loud on a recorded security feed to a federal bank officer. "That is perfectly fine, Mr. Evans." The manager lied smoothly. "Please sign your name on the primary line and then sign Rachel's name on the guarantor line right below it." I sat in my car, my heart beating in a slow, steady rhythm. The silence on the phone line stretched out for exactly 15 seconds. I could vividly picture Bradley sitting in the plush leather chair, picking up the heavy bank pen. I could picture him rationalizing the crime in his head, telling himself he was just doing what he had to do to survive, telling himself he would pay the money back before I ever noticed. I imagined the scratch of the pen against the premium paper as he deliberately forged my signature. "Thank you, Mr. Evans," the branch manager finally said. "We have everything we need. When will the funds be wired to my corporate account?" Bradley asked, the desperation bleeding through his attempt at a confident CEO persona. "My payroll deadline is at 2 o'clock this afternoon. The funds will not be wired to your account." Bradley, the branch manager, replied, his voice instantly dropping all pretense of customer service. The polite, accommodating tone vanished, replaced by the cold authority of a man protecting his institution. "What do you mean?" Bradley stammered. "You said if I signed the paperwork, the funds would clear." "The application has been flagged for massive, undeniable fraud," the manager stated clearly. "Your wife placed a high security alert on her social security number 3 weeks ago. We have been in direct contact with her since yesterday. She confirmed that you did not have her authorization to pledge her assets. You just knowingly signed a forged document inside a federally insured financial institution to secure a commercial loan under false pretenses." I heard a loud scraping sound through the phone as Bradley presumably shoved his chair back in absolute terror. "This is a misunderstanding." Bradley gasped, his voice escalating into a panicked shout. "I am her husband. We have joint accounts. I can explain this. Let me just take the paperwork back. The documents are now evidence," the manager said coldly. "And you are being recorded on multiple high-definition security cameras. We have already contacted the federal authorities. They are on their way. I suggest you wait quietly in this room." "I do not have to stay here," Bradley shouted. "You cannot hold me here." I heard the conference room door violently pull open, followed by the sound of rapid, heavy footsteps. Bradley was running. He was fleeing the scene of a federal crime, abandoning the forged documents on the table. Jonathan picked up the phone receiver on his end. "He is leaving the building. Rachel, the compliance officer, said. "Let him run," I replied, my voice steady and infinitely satisfied. He cannot outrun a 4K security camera and a signed confession. I kept my eyes on the revolving glass doors of the bank. Less than a minute later, Bradley burst out onto the sidewalk. He looked completely unhinged, his face pale, his chest heaving as he gasped for air. He looked frantically up and down the street, realizing that his entire life had just been fundamentally destroyed. He did not get the $500,000. He could not make payroll. His company was going to collapse by the end of the day, and he had just handed a federal prosecutor a perfect, fully documented case of felony wire and bank fraud. He practically threw himself into his luxury sports car, started the engine, and merged recklessly into the downtown Chicago traffic, desperate to escape. I watched his car disappear into the sea of mourning commuters. He thought he was driving away to figure out a new plan. He had no idea he was just driving directly toward his inevitable permanent ruin. I ended the call with the bank, set my phone down on the passenger seat, and smiled. The civil divorce was over. The criminal prosecution was about to begin. The inevitable collapse of a corrupt business does not happen in a vacuum. When Bradley fled from the downtown bank on Friday morning, terrified of the federal forgery trap I had set for him, he completely abandoned his post as chief executive officer. 2:00 came and went. The payroll accounts remained empty. By 3:00, the massive printing presses on the warehouse floor ground to a violent halt. The machine operators walked off the line. The delivery trucks stayed parked. The supply chain was officially dead. Bradley spent the entire weekend hiding in his mother's house, terrified that federal agents were going to knock down the door at any second. But federal white-collar investigations take time to build. The authorities were meticulously gathering the bank security footage and compiling the wire fraud evidence. Because the FBI did not arrest him over the weekend, Bradley's blind arrogance slowly began to return. He convinced himself that the bank manager had been bluffing. He convinced himself that he still had a chance to outsmart me. On Monday morning, a bonded legal courier knocked on the door of my home. He handed me a thick, heavy envelope bearing the seal of the United States Bankruptcy Court for the Northern District of Illinois. I took the envelope into my dining room, poured myself a cup of black coffee, and opened it. Facing absolute financial ruin, unable to pay his employees, and desperate to protect his century-old family legacy from my incoming lawsuits, Bradley and his mother had played what they genuinely believed was their ultimate trump card. They had formally filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection for the printing and packaging company. My cell phone rang a few minutes later. It was my lead litigation attorney. "Rachel," my lawyer said, her tone laced with professional disgust. "I assume you just received the bankruptcy notice." Bradley's legal team filed the petition electronically at midnight. They invoked the automatic stay. It is a federal injunction that immediately halts all our civil collection efforts, including our lawsuits to recover your stolen $3 million. I flipped through the dense legal filings, my eyes scanning the creditor matrix Bradley had submitted to the court under penalty of perjury. He listed my $3 million inheritance as an unsecured corporate loan. I observed, my voice perfectly calm. "That is his strategy," my lawyer confirmed. In a standard Chapter 11 reorganization, the current management stays in control of the business. They become what is known as a debtor in possession. Bradley intends to use the bankruptcy courts to restructure his debts, wipe out his liabilities, and keep the doors open. By classifying your $3 million as unsecured debt, he is attempting to completely erase it. In corporate bankruptcies, unsecured creditors are usually wiped out entirely or handed pennies on the dollar. He is using federal bankruptcy law as a shield to steal your money permanently. My phone buzzed with an incoming text message. I pulled it away from my ear and looked at the screen. It was a message from my mother-in-law, Barbara. She could not resist the urge to gloat. She had spent the entire weekend hiding in shame after her church humiliation, and now she felt victorious. The text message was brief, dripping with pearl-clutching arrogance. "You thought you were smart, but you get nothing. The business stays ours." I stared at the glowing screen of my phone. A slow, genuine smile spread across my face. Bradley and Barbara had hired expensive corporate bankruptcy lawyers to execute this maneuver. They thought they had found a brilliant legal loophole. They thought they had trapped me in a system where they held all the leverage. They completely forgot what I do for a living. I do not just understand bankruptcy law. I orchestrate it. I have spent a decade restructuring distressed assets, liquidating failed empires, and navigating the darkest corners of federal financial regulations. Bradley thought he was locking me out of his company by bringing it into a federal bankruptcy court. He had no idea he was actually inviting me directly into my own arena. Let them have their morning celebration, I told my lawyer, turning my attention back to the legal documents on my table. They think they are going to remain the debtor in possession. They think the judge is going to let Bradley stay in control of the company while he wipes out my debt. That is the standard procedure for Chapter 11, my lawyer cautioned. It is very difficult to remove a sitting chief executive officer during a bankruptcy proceeding. The courts prefer to let the existing management fix the mess. Usually, yes, I agreed smoothly. But the United States Bankruptcy Code has a very specific exception. Section 1104. It states that the court shall order the appointment of an independent trustee to take over the company if there is clear and convincing evidence of fraud, dishonesty, incompetence, or gross mismanagement by the current corporate leadership. The line went silent for a moment as my lawyer realized exactly what I was holding. "You have the affidavit," she said, her voice dropping into a sharp, predatory whisper. "I have the sworn, notarized affidavit from Madison," I confirmed. "I have her written confession detailing exactly how Bradley orchestrated the embezzlement of $3 million. I have the forensic trace of the offshore shell company. I have the digital invoices proving he engaged in gross mismanagement and corporate fraud. Bradley is not going to restructure his company. He is going to lose it entirely. File an emergency motion for the immediate appointment of a Chapter 11 trustee," I instructed her. "As the single largest creditor owed $3 million, I have the absolute legal standing to petition the court. And since the company requires complex financial liquidation to pay back its creditors, I am formally submitting my own name to the court as the proposed chief liquidating officer." We spent the next 48 hours drafting a devastating legal motion. We attached Madison's sworn confession as Exhibit A. We attached the forensic accounting logs showing the fake invoices and the Cayman Islands wire transfers as Exhibit B. We built a flawless, inescapable argument proving that Bradley was criminally unfit to maintain control of his family's century-old legacy. The emergency hearing was scheduled for Thursday morning at the Everett McKinley Dirksen United States Courthouse in downtown Chicago. I arrived wearing a tailored black suit, carrying a single leather briefcase. The courtroom was an imposing, solemn space, paneled in dark wood, designed to make people feel small. I did not feel small. I felt like an apex predator stepping into a familiar hunting ground. Bradley and Barbara were already seated at the petitioner's table. Bradley looked incredibly smug, wearing a fresh designer suit, chatting confidently with his high-priced bankruptcy attorney. Barbara was sitting in the gallery, directly behind him, her chin lifted in defiance, clearly believing they had outsmarted me. When I walked down the aisle and took my seat at the creditor's table, Bradley shot me a patronizing, victorious smile. He genuinely thought my $3 million was gone forever. The federal bankruptcy judge entered the courtroom, taking his seat behind the high bench. He was an older man with stern features, known for his absolute intolerance of corporate misconduct. He adjusted his glasses and looked down at the massive stack of emergency filings on his desk. "We are here today regarding the Chapter 11, reorganization of Evans Printing and Packaging," the judge announced, his voice echoing through the quiet room. "Before we proceed with the standard operational motions, I have an emergency petition filed by the primary creditor, Rachel Evans, requesting the immediate removal of current management and the appointment of a Chapter 11 trustee for the purpose of liquidation." Bradley's expensive lawyer immediately stood up, adjusting his suit jacket with an air of practiced dismissal. "Your Honor, this emergency motion is nothing more than a frivolous, bad faith tactic. The creditor is the estranged wife of the chief executive officer. They are currently engaged in a highly contentious civil divorce. She is simply using this federal bankruptcy court to wage a personal vendetta. Mr. Evans is fully capable of leading this company through a successful reorganization. The judge did not look at the defense attorney. He kept his eyes fixed entirely on the documents resting in front of him. He slowly turned the page to Exhibit A. "Is that so?" the judge asked, his tone deathly quiet. The judge picked up the sworn affidavit that I had cornered Madison into signing at the hotel lobby. He held it up for the entire courtroom to see. "Because I am currently looking at a sworn notarized affidavit from your client's own creative director." The judge continued, his voice growing significantly louder and far more dangerous. "This affidavit testifies under penalty of perjury that the chief executive officer intentionally established an offshore shell corporation in the Cayman Islands. It details exactly how he fabricated corporate invoices to illegally siphon $3 million of this creditor's money out of the company's operating accounts." Bradley's confident smirk vanished instantly. The color drained from his face so fast he looked physically ill. He whipped his head around to stare at his lawyer, panic flooding his eyes. He had absolutely no idea that Madison had flipped. He had no idea she had signed a confession. His lawyer looked completely blindsided, frantically flipping through his own copy of the motion packet that my team had served him just moments before the hearing. The judge turned the page to Exhibit B. He adjusted his glasses, his expression hardening into absolute disgust. Furthermore, the judge stated, his voice echoing with absolute authority, "The forensic accounting logs attached to this motion corroborate the affidavit perfectly. They show a clear, deliberate pattern of corporate embezzlement and gross financial mismanagement. Mr. Evans used fraudulent vendor portals to drain his own company's liquidity while simultaneously halting payroll for hundreds of innocent factory workers." Bradley slumped down in his chair, his hands gripping the edge of the mahogany table. He looked like he could not breathe. In the gallery behind him, Barbara let out a sharp, horrified gasp. She pressed her hand to her pearl necklace, her eyes wide as she realized the catastrophic reality of what was happening. Her text message boasting about keeping the business was aging incredibly poorly. "Your Honor," Bradley's lawyer stammered, clearly struggling to control the sudden implosion of his case. "We have not had adequate time to review these allegations. My client vehemently denies." "I do not care what your client denies," the judge interrupted, slamming his hand down on the bench. "The evidence of fraud here is overwhelming and, frankly, repulsive. The purpose of Chapter 11 protection is to allow honest business owners a chance to restructure their debts and save American jobs. It is not a shield for corrupt executives to hide stolen assets and defraud their creditors." The judge picked up his gavel. The courtroom held its collective breath. "I find that the current debtor in possession has engaged in egregious financial misconduct and gross mismanagement," the judge declared, looking directly at Bradley. "Mr. Evans, you are hereby stripped of all executive authority, fiduciary control, and operational access to this company, effective immediately. You are ordered to surrender all corporate keys, banking tokens, and access badges before you leave this building." Bradley sat completely frozen, his mouth hanging slightly open in absolute devastating shock. He had walked into this courthouse believing he was a brilliant corporate tactician. He was walking out stripped of his title, his legacy, and his company. The judge turned his attention to my table. "Given the extensive nature of the fraud, the court agrees that this company cannot be successfully reorganized under its current structure. It must be liquidated to maximize the return for the defrauded creditors. The primary creditor has petitioned for the appointment of a chief liquidating officer to assume total control of the estate." The judge looked down at my professional credentials, which my lawyer had included in the petition. He noted my decade of experience restructuring distressed corporate assets and managing complex financial liquidations. "The court approves the creditor's nominee," the judge announced. "Rachel Evans is hereby appointed as the chief liquidating officer of this estate, with full federal authority to seize, manage, and liquidate all corporate assets to satisfy the outstanding debts." The heavy wooden gavel slammed down with a loud final crack. "We are adjourned," the judge said, standing up and sweeping out of the courtroom. The silence that followed was absolute. Bradley sat at the defense table, his hands trembling violently. He slowly turned his head to look at me across the aisle. His eyes were hollow, filled with the terrifying realization that he had just lost his entire war. He thought filing for bankruptcy would wipe out my $3 million and secure his family business forever. Instead, his brilliant legal maneuver had given a federal judge the absolute authority to hand the keys of his century-old empire directly to me. I did not gloat. I did not smile. I simply stood up, buttoned my tailored black suit jacket, and placed my documents back into my leather briefcase. I looked at Bradley, and then I looked past him to Barbara, who was sitting in the gallery with tears of absolute devastation ruining her expensive makeup. "You thought you were smart," I said quietly, quoting her own text message back to her in the silent courtroom. "But you get nothing." I turned and walked out of the courtroom, my heels clicking sharply against the polished floor. I was no longer just a scorned wife. I was a federally appointed liquidator, and I was going to sell every single brick of their precious family legacy to get my money back. At my divorce hearings, my mother-in-law leaned in and sneered that leaving me was her son's best choice. She had no idea that the $3 million I sacrificed to save their family business wasn't lost to market forces like my husband claimed. It was stolen, and the bank records I was about to uncover would make her cruel lie completely impossible to maintain. The executive boardroom of Evans Printing and Packaging was a monument to generational wealth and unearned arrogance. The walls were paneled in rich, dark mahogany. Oil portraits of Bradley's father and grandfather hung in heavy gilded frames, staring down at the massive 20-foot conference table. For over a century, this room had been the beating heart of a Midwestern empire. Today, it was going to be its graveyard. Bradley and Barbara were already seated when I approached the heavy glass doors. Through the soundproof glass, I watched them. They genuinely still believed they had a fighting chance. Bradley was wearing his signature charcoal suit, his tie perfectly knotted, leaning back in his leather executive chair at the head of the table. He was whispering confidently to his bankruptcy lawyer. Barbara sat to his right, wearing her customary pearls and a stiff, defensive posture. She was sipping sparkling water, looking around the room as if she still owned it. Sitting quietly on Bradley's left was Madison. The 25-year-old pregnant mistress kept her eyes glued to the polished wood of the table. She was fidgeting with the massive diamond engagement ring on her left hand. I knew exactly why she was shaking. Bradley did not. I pushed open the heavy boardroom doors. I did not walk in alone. I was flanked by my lead litigation attorney and two stern, impeccably dressed federal auditors appointed by the bankruptcy court. The ambient chatter in the room died instantly. Bradley sat up straight, attempting to project the authority of a chief executive officer hosting a standard creditor meeting. He offered a tight, condescending smile. Rachel Bradley said, his voice echoing in the large room. "I am glad you brought your team. My lawyers have drawn up a preliminary restructuring plan. We are prepared to offer you a 30% equity stake in the new holding company to settle your $3 million claim. We can wrap this up today and keep the business running smoothly." I did not smile. I did not acknowledge his offer. I walked directly to the opposite end of the mahogany table, my heels clicking with a sharp, rhythmic finality. I lifted my heavy leather briefcase and dropped it directly onto the center of the table. The loud, heavy thud made Barbara flinch and clutch her pearl necklace. I opened the briefcase and pulled out a massive 400-page black binder. It contained every single financial record, every fraudulent invoice, every offshore routing number, and the absolute federal authority granted to me by the bankruptcy judge just 48 hours prior. I dropped the binder onto the table with a second, even louder thud. "I'm not here to negotiate a restructuring plan, Bradley," I said, my voice perfectly level and echoing with cold, absolute authority. "You no longer have the legal standing to offer me equity. You no longer have the legal standing to run this company. I am here in my capacity as the federally appointed chief liquidating officer of this estate. And my first official act is to terminate your employment." Bradley scoffed, letting out a harsh, nervous laugh. He looked at his lawyer, expecting a defense. "You cannot just fire me, Rachel. I am the CEO. I own the majority shares. My grandfather built this company." "Your grandfather built it, and you completely destroyed it," I corrected him smoothly. "As of 9 o'clock this morning, your shares are worthless." They have been seized by the bankruptcy trust to satisfy the massive fraudulent debts you accumulated. You are hereby terminated as Chief Executive Officer effective immediately. You are being dismissed for cause, specifically gross financial mismanagement, corporate embezzlement, and federal wire fraud. You will receive no severance package. You will receive no final paycheck. You are entirely stripped of all executive authority. Bradley's face flushed a deep, angry crimson. He slammed his hands down on the table and stood up. "You listen to me," he shouted, his voice cracking with panic. "You are not going to come into my building and treat me like some entry-level employee. I am the head of this family." One of the federal auditors stepped forward, opening a leather portfolio. Mr. Evans, the auditor, said, his voice completely devoid of emotion. "If you do not comply with the Chief Liquidating Officer's directives, we are authorized to summon the federal marshals waiting in the lobby to escort you off the premises in handcuffs. I highly suggest you sit down and listen." Bradley stared at the auditor, the reality of the federal badge pinned to the man's belt, finally penetrating his thick layer of delusion. He slowly sank back into his chair, his breathing ragged and shallow. The arrogant CEO persona completely evaporated, leaving behind a terrified, powerless man. "Now that we are clear on your employment status, I continued opening the black binder. We are going to address the recovery of corporate assets. During my preliminary audit last night, I discovered that this company has been funding a deeply inappropriate and lavish lifestyle for people who contribute absolutely nothing to the bottom line." I turned my gaze directly to Barbara. My mother-in-law froze her eyes, widening in sudden, gripping terror. "Barbara," I said, my tone as sharp as a scalpel, "for the last 10 years, you have been drawing a generous annual salary of $120,000 under the title of Senior Cultural Advisor. You do not have an office. You do not send emails. You do not perform any actual work. That phantom salary is officially terminated as of today." Barbara gasped, her hand flying to her chest. "You cannot do that. That money is my livelihood." "Bradley promised me that income for the rest of my life." "Your son made promises with money that did not belong to him," I replied coldly. "Furthermore, I have reviewed the corporate expense accounts. This company has been paying the $10,000 monthly membership dues for your exclusive country club. It has been paying the lease on your luxury sedan. It has been covering your tabs at high-end restaurants and your expensive spa treatments." I pulled a stack of pristine typed documents from the binder and slid them across the long mahogany table toward her. "As the liquidating officer, I have a legal fiduciary duty to claw back any fraudulent or wasteful corporate spending," I informed her. "I am officially seizing the luxury sedan sitting in the parking lot. You will hand the keys to the federal auditors before you leave this room. I have already contacted the country club and permanently canceled your membership. And finally, the bankruptcy trust will be filing a civil lawsuit against you personally to recover the millions of dollars in phantom salary you illegally siphoned from this dying company. You are going to have to sell your personal home just to pay back the estate." Barbara looked like she had just been struck by a freight train. Her mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. The pristine superior facade she had maintained for years crumbled into absolute dust. She looked at her son silently, pleading for him to save her, but Bradley was staring blankly at the table, completely paralyzed by his own ruin. Finally, I turned my attention back to Bradley. I reached across the table and tapped my manicured fingernail against the polished wood. "Hand over the keys to the corporate company car, Bradley," I demanded. "Hand over your corporate credit cards, your building access badge, and your company-issued smartphone. You do not own anything in this building anymore. Everything belongs to the creditors you defrauded." Bradley's hands were shaking violently. He reached into his tailored suit jacket and pulled out his leather wallet. He numbly extracted the black corporate credit cards and tossed them onto the table. He reached into his pocket, pulled out his heavy keychain, and removed the electronic fob for his expensive imported sports car. He slid it across the mahogany surface toward me. He looked up, his eyes bloodshot, filled with a desperate, frantic terror. He was looking for any possible lifeline, any shred of leverage he could use to save himself from total annihilation. He turned to his left, his eyes locking onto Madison. "Madison, tell them," Bradley pleaded, his voice cracking horribly. "Tell the auditors the truth. Tell them the offshore account was entirely your idea. Tell them you managed the vendor payments and I just signed the paperwork without looking. You are the creative director. You set up Horizon Creative Solutions. If you just explain that this was a massive misunderstanding, we can fix this. He was trying to throw his pregnant mistress directly under the bus to save his own skin. It was the ultimate display of cowardice. He genuinely believed that the naive 25-year-old girl who had worshipped his wealth would willingly take the fall for a federal crime to protect him. Madison did not say a word. She sat perfectly still, her eyes fixed firmly on her lap, a single tear sliding silently down her cheek. I smiled. It was a cold, calculating, and entirely merciless smile. "She is not going to take the fall for you, Bradley," I said quietly. I reached into my blazer pocket and pulled out my smartphone. When I cornered Madison in the lobby of the Palmer House Hotel days ago, I did not just make her sign a sworn notarized affidavit. I had placed my phone face down on the mahogany table, and I had recorded every single second of her terrified, hysterical confession. I unlocked the screen, pulled up the audio file, and maximized the volume. I set the phone down in the center of the boardroom table and pressed play. The crystal clear audio filled the silent room. "Please." Rachel Madison's recorded voice sobbed through the speakers, echoing off the oil portraits of Bradley's ancestors. "You have to understand. Bradley lied to me. He told me the money was clean. He told me we were going to the Cayman Islands to start a new life. He used my name on a fake company to steal $3 million from you. He told me it was foolproof. Now he has no money, the company is failing, and he expects me to just sit there and take the fall for the offshore account. I cannot go to jail. He ruined my life." I let the recording play until the final devastating sob echoed through the room. I reached out and tapped the screen, pausing the audio. The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating, and absolute. Bradley sat frozen, his eyes wide, staring at the smartphone on the table as if it were an unexploded bomb. His jaw trembled. He slowly turned his head to look at Madison. The illusion of their grand romantic love affair, the fantasy they had built while destroying my marriage, was completely annihilated in front of a room full of federal auditors. She had sold him out to save herself, and he was completely, utterly alone. Madison Bradley whispered, his voice sounding hollow and entirely broken. "You told her everything. You betrayed me." Madison finally lifted her head. She looked at the man who had promised her a billionaire lifestyle, private jets, and endless luxury. She saw a man who was stripped of his title, drowning in debt, and facing years in a federal penitentiary. She saw a sinking ship, and she had already secured her life jacket. She did not offer him an apology. She did not shed another tear. Madison stood up slowly, pushing her heavy leather chair back from the mahogany table. She reached out with her right hand and grasped the massive, flashy diamond engagement ring sitting on her left ring finger. She pulled the ring off in one smooth motion. She placed the diamond on the polished wood of the boardroom table. The heavy metal made a soft, sharp clink that sounded incredibly loud in the dead, silent room. "I am not going to federal prison for you," Bradley Madison said, her voice completely devoid of emotion. She turned on her heel, picked up her designer handbag, and walked out of the boardroom. She did not look back. The heavy glass door swung shut behind her, sealing Bradley inside the nightmare of his own making. The sound of the door closing seemed to shatter whatever fragile restraint Barbara had left. My mother-in-law collapsed forward, burying her face in her hands. She broke down into loud, hysterical, ugly sobs. Her shoulders heaved as she wept for her lost social status, her seized luxury cars, her canceled country club memberships, and the absolute destruction of her family's century-old legacy. The empire she had proudly weaponized against me was completely gone, reduced to federal evidence and liquidation paperwork. Bradley did not comfort his mother. He sat perfectly still, staring blankly at the diamond engagement ring abandoned on the mahogany table. He had traded a loyal, brilliant wife and $3 million for a cheap illusion, and he had ended up with absolutely nothing. I stood at the head of the table, flanked by the federal auditors, looking down at the ruins of the people who had tried to break me. I felt no pity. I felt no sorrow. I felt the pure, unadulterated peace of a perfectly balanced ledger. Auditors, I said, turning to the federal agent standing beside me, please begin the physical asset seizure protocols. Lock down the executive offices, seize all the computer servers, and freeze the remaining localized accounts. I picked up my heavy black binder and my briefcase. I did not say another word to Bradley or Barbara. I turned and walked out of the boardroom, leaving them trapped in the consequences of their own spectacular greed. The wheels of federal justice grind exceedingly slow, but they grind with an absolute terrifying precision. It took exactly 7 months for the United States Attorney's Office to finalize their sprawling indictment against Bradley. I never had to take the witness stand at a highly publicized trial because there was no trial. When a federal prosecutor walks into a room and drops a forged bank document signed on high-definition security cameras alongside digital routing logs, proving the bribery of municipal zoning officials, high-priced defense attorneys do not fight. They beg for plea deals. I sat in the back row of the federal courthouse on the brisk autumn morning of his sentencing. The room was heavy with the solemn, suffocating weight of federal authority. Bradley stood before the judge wearing a standard-issue drab orange jumpsuit. The custom-tailored charcoal suits, the perfectly styled hair, and the arrogant smirks were completely gone. His shoulders were hunched, his hands were shackled at his waist, and he looked incredibly, pathetically small. The federal judge did not show a single ounce of leniency. He stared down from the high bench and lectured Bradley for 20 straight minutes on his profound abuse of corporate privilege, his reckless destruction of a century-old legacy, and his blatant, arrogant disregard for the law. The heavy wooden gavel struck the sounding block, the sharp crack echoing through the cavernous courtroom like a gunshot. Bradley was sentenced to 8 years in a federal penitentiary with absolutely no possibility of early parole for white-collar financial crimes. I watched the federal marshal step forward to escort him out. The cold, heavy click of the metal chains locking around his wrists was the exact sound of a closed ledger. As they turned him toward the side door, he looked back over his shoulder and found me sitting in the gallery. We locked eyes for one final second. There was no hatred left in his gaze, no threats, and no empty promises. There was only the hollow, devastating realization that he had engineered his own absolute ruin. He had traded a brilliant, loyal partner for a cheap illusion, and the transaction had cost him his freedom. I did not blink. I did not nod. I simply watched him disappear behind the heavy steel door, erasing him from my life forever. While Bradley lost his freedom, his mother lost the only thing she had ever truly valued in this world: her social standing. The bankruptcy court was ruthlessly efficient in clawing back the fraudulent corporate transfers Bradley had utilized to maintain Barbara's lavish lifestyle. The luxury sedan was repossessed from her driveway in broad daylight, while her wealthy suburban neighbors watched eagerly from behind their manicured hedges. Her sprawling, meticulously decorated estate, which Bradley had secretly leveraged to the absolute limit to cover his mounting debts, was formally foreclosed upon by the bank and sold at a public auction. Stripped of her stolen wealth and her unearned pride, Barbara was forced to move into a tiny, rundown apartment complex on the industrial edge of town. It was a bleak, depressing building with peeling gray paint, flickering hallway lights, and neighbors who did not care in the slightest about her country club pedigree or her pearl necklaces. In a desperate, pathetic attempt to maintain some fragile illusion of her former glory, she tried to attend the 10 o'clock Sunday service at the affluent Presbyterian church one last time. I heard the story later from my former divorce attorney. Barbara walked into the grand fellowship hall, fully expecting her usual circle of wealthy wives to flock to her side with sympathetic murmurs and comforting hugs. Instead, they parted like the Red Sea. Women she had gossiped with for decades, women she had considered her closest allies, suddenly found urgent reasons to look away. They turned their backs, clutching their coffee cups and engaging in hushed, forced conversations about the new youth center. The church elder board had made it abundantly clear to the congregation that the Evans family was a radioactive financial liability. Barbara was completely, utterly shunned. She stood alone in the center of the hall for 5 agonizing minutes before she finally broke down. She left the church in tears, returning to her cramped, silent apartment, permanently exiled by the very society she had sacrificed my marriage to impress. With my abusers permanently removed from the board, I focused my entire energy on my federally appointed mandate. I was the chief liquidating officer of Evans Printing and Packaging, and I executed the systematic dismantling of the century-old empire with absolute surgical precision. The company was far too leveraged to be saved under its current debt structure, but the physical assets were highly valuable. I spent 4 exhausting months meticulously inventorying the industrial printing presses, the massive warehouse real estate, and the remaining viable client contracts. I did not sell the assets off in pieces to predatory liquidators. I wanted a clean, profitable, and ethical transaction. I reached out directly to Thomas Caldwell, the massive regional distributor who had backed out of Bradley's deal at the charity gala. Caldwell deeply respected my straightforward, honest approach to financial restructuring. He leveraged his network and introduced me to a highly reputable, rapidly expanding packaging competitor located in the Midwest. We sat in a sterile, neutral conference room, surrounded by lawyers and accountants, and I negotiated the complete total sale of the Evans corporate assets. The competitor absorbed the heavy machinery and the real estate at a premium market valuation. Most importantly, they agreed to offer immediate employment contracts to the displaced factory workers and warehouse operators who had lost their livelihoods when Bradley recklessly halted payroll. I signed the final transfer documents with my grandmother's vintage gold pen, officially closing the book on 100 years of the Evans family business. The toxic legacy was completely erased, replaced by a clean, balanced, and highly profitable transaction. The capital generated from the corporate liquidation was substantial. As the primary secured creditor recognized by the federal court, my claims were prioritized above all others. I recouped every single cent of my $3 million inheritance, but I did not stop there. The federal bankruptcy judge, thoroughly disgusted by the egregious nature of Bradley's fraud and the prolonged timeline of the offshore embezzlement, authorized the payment of maximum statutory interest on the stolen funds. In the parallel civil court system, my divorce attorney finalized the absolute permanent dissolution of my marriage. Because Bradley was incarcerated and his financial misconduct was a matter of indisputable federal record, the family court judge awarded me heavily punitive damages. I was granted full, uncontested ownership of the marital home in Evanston. I immediately sold the 5-bedroom colonial to a lovely young family for a significant cash profit, washing my hands of the tainted memories entirely. The offshore account in the Cayman Islands was formally seized by federal authorities. The contents repatriated to the United States Bankruptcy Trust and distributed to the legitimate vendors Bradley had cheated. Madison, stripped of her stolen wealth and the grand illusion of a billionaire lifestyle, quietly moved back to her small hometown in another state. She was currently facing 3 years of strict federal probation for her role as the proxy in the shell company, carrying the heavy burden of a felony record for the rest of her life. The financial war was over. The battlefield was cleared. I had emerged not just whole, but exponentially stronger and vastly wealthier than when I started. A year after I sat in that cold parking garage gripping the steering wheel in tears, my life looked entirely different. I did not return to my old consulting firm. The grueling high-stakes experience of dismantling my own marital disaster had ignited a new, fierce, and undeniable ambition inside me. I took my recovered $3 million inheritance, the massive profits from the sale of the Evanston house, and the punitive damages from the civil divorce, and I founded my own independent corporate restructuring and financial forensics firm. I built a powerhouse team of sharp, hungry financial analysts and brilliant litigation attorneys who specialized in distressed asset recovery and corporate fraud. Within 6 months, we became the premier firm that venture capitalists and board members called when they suspected a chief executive officer was secretly cooking the books. It was a crisp Tuesday morning, and I was sitting in the center of my newly leased corporate office. It was a stunning high-rise executive suite in the very heart of downtown Chicago, surrounded by towering floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the brilliant sunlit expanse of Lake Michigan. The space was modern, sleek, and entirely mine. There were no oil portraits of arrogant inherited ancestors hanging on my walls. There were no ghosts of a fraudulent legacy whispering in the corridors. There was only clean architectural glass, polished steel accents, and the quiet, steady hum of a highly successful business operating entirely under my exact specifications. I stood up from my wide mahogany desk and walked slowly toward the windows, looking out at the sprawling city grid below. The morning light caught the reflection of the glass, illuminating the delicate piece of jewelry resting perfectly against my collarbone. It was my grandmother's Art Deco platinum diamond pendant. I had kept the necklace safely locked away in a bank vault for months, waiting for the exact right moment to wear it again. Today felt like the perfect moment. The diamond sparkled with a brilliant, undeniable clarity under the natural sunlight. It was no longer a stolen piece of property decorating the neck of a frightened, greedy mistress trying to play dress-up. It was a profound symbol of resilience, a beloved family heirloom that I had ruthlessly fought for and reclaimed with my own two hands. I raised my porcelain cup and took a slow, deep sip of hot black coffee. The rich, bitter taste grounded me perfectly in the present moment. I thought about the woman who had sat on that hard wooden bench in the Cook County courthouse, terrified that she had lost her future, her finances, and her grandfather's legacy to a manipulative husband and a cruel status-obsessed mother-in-law. That woman was completely gone. The person standing in this sunlit, high-rise office was peaceful, untouchable, and infinitely powerful. The financial ledgers were perfectly balanced. The debts had been paid in full with devastating interest. I had lost a deeply flawed marriage, but I had gained an absolute, unbreakable sovereignty over my own life. I had built my own empire, and I held the only set of keys. To anyone who has ever been told they are the broken one, by the very people breaking them. Silence is not a virtue when it costs you your life. Let them underestimate you. Then, let the paper trail do the talking. If you believe in cold, hard karma, hit subscribe, drop a like, and tell me in the comments what city and time you're watching from. I'll see you in the next story.